As is typical for unfortunate heroines, transmigration usually resolves all the disadvantages stacked against them for the next round of the game. The young girl passes away, only to awaken inside a novel. Shortly after, the male lead, who bears the familiar title of Duke, enters her life. In truth, this trope is nothing groundbreaking, yet the story manages to pull you in regardless, thanks to its surprisingly fast-paced plot. One day, our heroine transmigrates and awakens, with fate steering her directly toward the Duke. This is precisely where our tale begins, with a blindfolded young man asking our heroine how she is adjusting to life in the Duke's castle. Beaming from ear to ear, our girl enthusiastically declares just how much she adores living there. Naturally, she is thinking about her new bed, which is warm, plush, and significantly softer than anything she has ever slept on. That goes without even mentioning the food, which can only be described as magnificent. More importantly, however, this position offers an exceptionally generous salary. For all these reasons, our heroine Marin is absolutely convinced that the Duke's castle is her paradise. After hearing such effusive praise, the young man wearing the black blindfold asks if that is truly how she feels. He then says, "Then marry me." Her eyes widen in an instant. Wondering if she might have misheard him, she asks the Duke to please repeat what he just said. But when he repeats it, it becomes blatantly clear that she imagined nothing. He has genuinely asked for her hand in marriage. The girl begins to stammer, suggesting that she might have a hearing problem and really ought to see a doctor, but the Duke simply asks her to sit back down. She complies, well aware that she has no real choice in the matter. Even so, she continues to stare at him in absolute shock. A betrothal to a commoner. What on earth could the Duke be thinking? She even starts to wonder if he is merely teasing her again. Attempting to lighten the mood, Marin remarks that the Duke seems quite playful today, and even offers to read the day's reports aloud to change the subject. Naturally, the Duke refuses to let the matter drop so easily, pressing her to answer whether this is truly what she wants out of life. He then addresses her by her full name, Lady Marin Schwentz, causing the blood to drain from her face. She has spent every waking moment in this castle trying to hide her true origins, yet he has known the truth all along. He is fully aware that she concealed her ties to a noble family just to enter the Duke's estate and secure employment. Marin freezes completely. Unable to believe she has been unmasked so thoroughly, every instinct in her body screams for her to run. However, fleeing is simply not an option. Instead, she is forced to sit and listen, as the Duke coldly asks if she really thought she could deceive the Duchy of Bynes with such ease. The poor girl feels genuinely nauseous, unable to fathom where her supposedly flawless performance went wrong. The only thing she knows for certain now is that her end is rapidly approaching. Not too long ago, the girl resided in a modest house surrounded by nature. One morning, she walked into her mother's room to find the woman gazing quietly out the window. Holding a breakfast tray, she gently asked if her mother had woken up. Her mother replied by asking if Marin had slept well, looking incredibly tired despite her unmistakable love for her daughter. Brimming with cheer, the girl presented the tray, proudly announcing that she had brought delicious honey biscuits and a wonderful bowl of soup for breakfast. But her mother insisted she would eat later, urging the young girl to take care of herself first, even as Marin watched her strength fade with each passing day. Fighting back her tears, Marin knew that if her mother continued to skip meals, she would not survive the approaching winter. Hoping to cheer her up, Marin offered to read aloud from one of her mother's favorite books that evening, which visibly brightened the woman's mood. In truth, the woman's spirits always seemed to lift whenever the girl read aloud to her, leaving Marin surprised she had not thought of doing it sooner. Just then, a sudden knock at the door drew Marin's attention. She quickly told her mother she would go check who it was, leaving the bowl of soup by her side and begging her to at least try eating while she was gone. Upon opening the door, the girl was greeted by Yorno, the landlord who managed their property. She greeted the man with barely concealed disdain, having absolutely no desire to see the rat, yet needing to know why he had come. He questioned why she was being so formal, given how long they had known each other. But Marin, wanting nothing to do with him, retorted that he should leave if he had nothing important to say. Before she could shut the door, however, he braced his arm against it to block her path. He finally announced that starting that very month, their rent would be tripled, leaving Marin struggling to comprehend how he could change the terms so drastically without any warning. Clearly irritated, he insisted that he had raised the rent for everyone else a long time ago, and that delaying the increase for Marin had been a special concession. The undeniable problem was that Marin had absolutely no way to come up with that kind of money on such short notice, leaving her with no option but to beg Giorno for an extension. A sly smile slithered across the man's face as he suggested that if she was so desperate, he had other ways for her to settle the debt, reaching toward her in a way that visibly unsettled the girl. Terrified, Marin slammed the door in his face just as his grubby fingers brushed close to her clothes. Even then, the man bellowed furiously from the other side, calling her frigid and threatening to throw both her and her mother onto the streets if she did not have the money by his next visit. Standing alone in the room, the girl's thoughts spun wildly out of control. She fought desperately to hold herself together and keep from crumbling right then and there. With winter fast approaching, Marin could not allow herself and her ailing mother to be cast out into the cold with nowhere to go. Because of this, she needed to find a way to secure that money as quickly as humanly possible. Opening one of her drawers, the girl arrived at a grim conclusion. She had no choice but to resort to a plan she had been trying to avoid for a very long time. She pulled out a stack of papers entitled The Nightingale of the Western Duke Never Weeps, which looked like an ordinary novel, though it held a secret only Marin knew. She had read countless novels centered around northern dukes in her time. However, she had chosen this particular one, about the Western Duke, simply because she craved something a bit different. As fate would have it, she had transmigrated into that exact world and had been living there all this time. She still occasionally marveled at how utterly absurd her reality had become. In her previous life, she had been involved in a severe car accident and spent nearly a month in a coma. But when Marin finally awoke, she realized that the world she now inhabited was the setting of that very novel. She had managed to figure it out solely because she recognized the Western Duke. The overall plot of The Nightingale of the Western Duke Never Weeps was relatively straightforward. Essentially, the male lead, the Western Duke, had been blinded and gravely wounded following a vicious monster attack. His suffering continued until he met the female lead, a medical prodigy possessing the unique ability to restore his sight. Following that fateful meeting, the two leads fell deeply in love, just like in any classic fantasy novel. In this grand narrative, Marin was nothing more than a background character who had never even been mentioned in the original story. She was a passing stranger and nothing more than that. Her primary role was supposed to be staying out of trouble so the Duke could smoothly reach his destined happy ending. Right now, however, she was in desperate need of a large sum of money. Her new family belonged to the Schwenz clan, an exceptionally wealthy Viscount household. Unfortunately, after a tragic carriage accident claimed the lives of her father and only brother, the massive debts her father had secretly amassed were suddenly exposed. Marin barely had a moment to adapt to her new life before her entire family collapsed, allowing financial ruin to swallow her whole. After liquidating everything they owned, their sole remaining possession was the antique vanity her father had once gifted her. With her family utterly ruined, Marin was never formally introduced to high society, rendering her title as a Viscount's daughter completely useless. Up until this point, Marin had done everything in her power to survive while ignoring the novel's plot, but she had finally reached her absolute limit. Relying on the skills she had retained from her past life and the unique knowledge she held about this world, Marin decided it was time to utilize every single weapon at her disposal. Consequently, the young girl made her way to the Duke's grand manor a short while later. Dressed in her finest attire, she waited patiently for the interviewer to call her name. The young man who received her couldn't help but compliment her on her impeccable penmanship. Still feeling a bit flustered, she politely thanked him for the kind words. This interaction served as living proof that she was indeed trapped inside a novel. After all, she was standing face to face with Olive Leon, who had just pointed out how incredibly rare it was to find a literate woman. Marin did her best to collect her thoughts while processing the surreal fact that she was, for the very first time, meeting a major character from the novel, and none other than the Duke's personal assistant, no less. When the young man inquired how Marin had learned to write, she spun a fabricated tale about picking it up at a count's household during a previous job, claiming they had noticed her love of books and taught her everything. She added that she had been rereading some of her old books lately, as purchasing new ones would be far too expensive. Even though her story sounded quite convincing, our girl still worried she might appear overly suspicious to Olive. In this particular world, the vast majority of young noble women simply did not learn how to read or write. Instead, they dedicated their time to studying musical instruments or cultivating an appreciation for fine art. However, in her previous life, Marin had always kept her nose firmly buried in a book. She had constantly begged her father to teach her how to write, spending the remainder of her free time reading voraciously. The main issue was that all this reading had severely limited her social contact with the few noble young ladies she was acquainted with. Olive snapped her out of her thoughts by stating that while he was indeed looking for an assistant, he was specifically searching for a male candidate. He explained that he had received notice about a young man named Marin coming in with a referral. Because of this, Olive was understandably confused to find a young woman standing before him instead. She realized she had no choice but to lie. Otherwise, she wouldn't even make it through the front door, let alone secure a meeting with the Duke. She had even toyed briefly with the idea of disguising herself as a man. However, the Duke was far too perceptive to be fooled by such a flimsy ruse, and would undoubtedly see right through her in an instant. Sticking to her lie, she asserted that Marin was her older brother who had relocated to the capital for work, but she simply couldn't bear to miss out on such a wonderful opportunity to work in the duchy. Despite her plea, Olive explained that the castle already had enough maids, and hiring domestic staff fell under the head butler's jurisdiction, meaning he wasn't even involved in those matters. The second Marin heard the words, "I believe this interview is concluded," she refused to let the young man finish his sentence, desperately crying out that he would absolutely need her services. Taken completely by surprise, Olive paused and asked if he truly did need her help. Without skipping a beat, Marin confidently explained that her assistance would be of particular benefit to His Grace, the Duke himself. That single bold declaration was enough to completely shift the atmosphere in the room. Well, Marin pointed out, there wasn't a single soul in the Western lands who didn't know about the unfortunate incident that had befallen the Duke. She had clearly crossed a dangerous line, as Olive's brow furrowed deeply, while he demanded to know if she even realized what she was saying, before sternly ordering her to leave. However, our girl simply refused to back down. Suddenly, she spotted a book resting on the desk and realized that she could use it to demonstrate her unique skills right then and there. Without a moment's hesitation, she lunged forward to grab the object, rapidly flipping through its pages while completely ignoring Olive's frantic shouts of protest. Snatching the book up, Marin began to recite aloud, "Beasts, where do they come from?" Olive stood there looking utterly spellbound, having never seen anyone read with such remarkable clarity and cadence before. It happened to be a text detailing monsters, stating that many scholars had pondered this exact question without ever arriving at a definitive answer regarding their origins. Marin continued reading, explaining that scholars were entirely captivated by a specific theory, one that remained unproven, suggesting that a monster's ecosystem constantly changes and adapts to fit whatever environment it happens to inhabit. Interestingly enough, the vast majority of scholars completely dismissed this idea. After reading a few more passages, she looked squarely into Olive's eyes, while he stood there looking visibly stunned, and confidently asked if he would like her to continue. She suggested that since the Duke was unable to review documents on his own, she could easily read them aloud for his benefit. Knowing he would receive a massive volume of material requiring review, Marin knew her skills could truly shine here, skills she only possessed because she had been a professional voice actress in her past life. Once again, with the book still firmly in hand, she confidently declared that she would be of great use to the Duke. Finally relenting, Olive instructed her to take a seat. At the very least, it seemed she now had a small glimmer of hope of actually getting something out of this encounter. Nevertheless, the young man gently explained that he still didn't possess the authority to officially hire her himself. Hearing this, Marin exhaled a heavy, defeated sigh, no longer sure of what she was supposed to do next. How on earth was she going to pay her rent, or afford the money she desperately needed for her mother's medicine? Despite the setback, Olive made sure to note that she read exceptionally well. He honestly admitted that they had been struggling tremendously when it came to reading important documents aloud to the Duke. Ultimately, he realized that Marin might just be the perfect solution to this ongoing problem, causing hope to return to our heroine's eyes once more. Clutching the book tightly against her chest, she eagerly asked if his implication meant she had been hired, which he promptly confirmed. Offering a warm smile, the young man suggested they head straight to the Duke's quarters to deliver the good news together. They navigated through the dark, winding corridors of the Grand Manor in complete and utter silence, with Marin only noting that the ambient light seemed to grow dimmer and dimmer with every step they took forward. For a fleeting moment, Marin felt as though she had wandered into a deep cave completely devoid of any light whatsoever. Breaking the silence, Olive mentioned that His Grace was extraordinarily sensitive to any form of light. Because of this specific condition, if she was truly going to serve the Duke, Olive was prepared to brief her on a great many things she would need to be extremely careful about. Finally, they arrived at the young man's private study, where Olive knocked softly and carefully on the heavy door. Inside the room, His Grace sat at his desk wrapped in perfect silence, remaining still until he finally bade his attendant to enter. Marin followed closely behind him, doing her absolute best not to make a single sound. The very moment she laid eyes on him, her own eyes lit up with undeniable excitement. She was genuinely standing face to face with the hero of the novel, the bluebird of the Western Duke does not cry. Duke Gerald wore a stark black blindfold that completely concealed his eyes, a feature that only served to make him look all the more mysterious and compelling. Olive respectfully explained that he wished to hire someone new, but noted that since this appeared to be a matter requiring His Grace's direct approval, he had brought her here. That statement alone was enough to irritate the Duke, who wondered out loud since when he had to be involved in every trivial matter concerning the servants. The crucial difference, Olive clarified, was that this particular servant was rather special, and having her nearby would prove to be of immense benefit. Gerald impatiently shot back that he had already consulted with every physician available in the Empire, prompting the young man to clarify that she was not a doctor at all. He simply believed her unique talents could assist the Duke. He only required a small fraction of His Grace's time to properly prove it. Marin took the provided sheet of paper and prepared to start reading, though her hands trembled slightly from sheer nerves. She knew full well that she could execute this flawlessly, but more importantly, she absolutely needed to succeed. And so Marin began reading an urgent report regarding a newly discovered silver mine in the Neron region, immediately striking the Duke with the pristine quality of her voice. The document detailed the findings of his men's annual survey, alongside specific locations where subterranean monsters had been appearing within the tunnels. The young Duke listened with intense focus as she read, making it feel as though Marin's soothing voice filled every single corner of the dim room. The report clearly stated that mining experts believed the best course of action was an immediate closure of the mine, calling for urgent measures to rectify the problem. They formally requested a written order mandating the immediate shutdown of the silver mines. As she finished reading the final line, the girl suddenly realized that this entire event had been a major part of the original story. This specific silver mine served as a fairly significant plot point situated right in the middle of the novel, as it was the exact location where the female lead had gone to gather medicinal herbs, only to stumble upon a few unique mineral stones along the way. Sometime later in the story, the heroine had fashioned those very stones into a stunning necklace, leaving the entire noble class utterly captivated by the strange glittering gems. As it ultimately turned out, the mine didn't actually contain silver, but rather a completely new kind of gemstone never before seen in the kingdom. These stones would soon be known as opals, the first gems ever discovered to possess such a unique shimmering play of light. Naturally, the market price for these gems skyrocketed the instant they were introduced to high society. For some odd reason, Marin hadn't recalled any of this crucial information until just now, realizing that if she had secretly done a bit of digging herself, she could have become wealthy in the blink of an eye. She was so deeply lost in her own thoughts that the words, "what a waste," accidentally slipped from her lips, prompting the Duke to step closer to uncover what exactly she was referring to. Marin hadn't even noticed him moving so close to her, causing her to flinch backward in genuine surprise. Gerald sternly asked her once more what she had meant by calling the situation a waste. The sudden confrontation was utterly terrifying for the young girl, who immediately took a frightened step back. She panicked so thoroughly that she ended up tripping clumsily over her own feet, nearly falling flat on her face right in the middle of the castle lord's study before she had even been officially hired. Fortunately, the Duke managed to catch her wrist just in the nick of time, grasping her shoulder in one swift, fluid motion to keep her upright. Incredibly grateful to the Duke for saving her from a nasty fall, our girl found herself absolutely drenched in a cold sweat from the sheer tension of the moment. She remained completely transfixed by the strikingly handsome man standing so closely in front of her. Of course, one would normally expect a male lead to look even more captivating up close. But she also knew perfectly well that this was hardly the time to be admiring his flawless face. Strangely enough, he was still holding tightly onto her hand, showing absolutely no sign of letting go anytime soon. Finally breaking the silence, Gerald turned his head slightly toward Olive and asked if he was truly known throughout the kingdom as a man of great patience. By that point, our heroine was so thoroughly flustered that in a desperate bid to change the subject, she impulsively blurted out something about monsters right in front of the young Duke, which successfully drew a flicker of Gerald's attention, even though he couldn't quite grasp why she had chosen to bring up monsters at this exact moment. Still feeling somewhat flustered, the girl admitted her knowledge that dungeon monsters were naturally drawn to shiny minerals similar to gemstones, suggesting that if monsters were appearing this frequently, there could very well be other precious materials buried there, even if it wasn't silver. Still refusing to let go of her wrist, Gerald demanded to know the name of this audacious girl, confirming for himself that she was indeed a mere commoner. Glancing down at her captured wrist, Marin waited for him to finally release her hand, but the young Duke was far more focused on the remarkable fact that a commoner knew how to read, let alone analyze official reports. Pulling her hand in slightly closer, the Duke abruptly accused her of being a spy, causing the poor terrified girl to cry out and desperately deny the allegation. Being accused of espionage was the absolute last thing she needed in a high-stakes situation like this. And yet it appeared the young Duke was entirely serious, without a single trace of doubt showing on his stoic face. At long last, he released Marin's hand and instructed Olive to draw up a provisional employment contract, at least for the time being. In that exact moment, a wide, hopeful smile spread across the girl's face as she thanked him profusely for granting her this incredible opportunity. She bowed deeply before the Duke just as he issued yet another unexpected order to his assistant, instructing him to ensure Marin was fed, something that even Olive had not anticipated hearing from his master. Gerald then explained that Marin's wrist felt as thin as a twig, delivering an entirely unnecessary insult to the poor, starving girl. Of course he would think something like that, considering his hands were enormous, making anyone's wrists look like those of a small child in comparison. Following this highly unexpected encounter, the Duke was finally left alone in the quiet solitude of his study. And for the first time in what felt like ages, he seemed to be lost in a thoughtful daze. He found himself genuinely thinking that Marin seemed to be a rather intriguing woman, noting that her voice didn't irritate his sensitive ears in the slightest. On the contrary, Gerald couldn't even recall the last time he had listened to a verbal report and actually engaged with its contents, finally understanding exactly why Olive had persisted so stubbornly. The Bynes clan, revered protectors of the Western lands, held a deeply guarded bloodline secret passed down exclusively to the direct heir of every generation. They possessed eyes capable of accurately discerning the eye color of a bird in flight from a massive distance, ears that could clearly distinguish every single sound within a 50-meter radius, alongside a tongue and nose that could flawlessly identify any scent or subtle flavor, and skin sensitive enough to perceive even the absolute lightest of touches. Every single sense possessed by the members of this powerful clan far surpassed the normal limits of ordinary human ability. And among all of his ancestors, Gerald von Bynes was recognized as the most acute and sensitive of all the dukes. The Great Bynes clan, acting as the steadfast guardians of the Western vineyards, held on to an unbreakable conviction. This formidable reputation had only grown in renown and respect under the leadership of the current Duke. Unfortunately, a vicious monster attack a year prior had permanently robbed the Duke of his sight, throwing everything within the duchy into absolute turmoil. As if attempting to compensate for the crucial sight he had lost, his remaining senses grew sharper and even more potent than before. However, because of this overwhelming sensitivity, his mind had begun to wear down at an ever-increasing rate, with his enhanced hearing causing the most distress of all. Rumor had it that even the minuscule sound of a beetle crawling across the floor reverberated painfully through his head like a massive crack of thunder. The peculiar girl continued to linger in his thoughts. He understood perfectly well that she was terrified of him, yet she had still attempted to lie to his face regardless. The young Duke had clearly heard the erratic, fearful pounding of her heartbeat, knowing she was frightened, and yet she had bravely lied to him anyway. Intrigued by the situation, the Duke summoned his trusted attendant Kay by name, explicitly ordering him to uncover everything there was to know about that girl. Looking into every single detail of her life, as well as the exact truth of her origins, Kay was every bit as enigmatic and capable as Gerald himself, typically handling all of the young Duke's most secretive and covert assignments. On the other side of the castle, Marin let out a near shriek upon discovering that the contract Olive had drawn up listed her salary at 1 gold coin per week. A single gold coin, after all, was more than enough for her to live on for an entire month. She was beginning to understand, at last, why people always said one should serve a wealthy master. Olive explained that she was being classified as a special employee, hence the elevated pay, and that rang true. She recalled that in the original work, there had indeed been individuals who held positions of exactly that caliber. Spies who had infiltrated the Eastern Territories, the Duke's shadow known as Kay, a blacksmith from House Dokal by the name of Marin, and even an alchemist called Zero. Out of curiosity, she asked whether her salary would rise if she became a permanent employee, which Olive confirmed. And that only made her all the more eager, while he urged her to work even harder to earn that position. Without a second thought, she signed the entire stack of documents, even though the young man had asked her not to rush and to read through everything carefully. But our girl was certain a ducal family like that would never deceive her in such a way, right? But that was not all. The young man then handed her a book, explaining that since she had mentioned wanting to read it, he wished for her to have it. Glancing at the title, Marin realized this was the very same book she had once read before. Cradling it in her hands, she remarked that it looked quite valuable, and asked once more whether it was truly hers to keep. When Olive explained they would have discarded it regardless, our girl's expression shifted entirely. She immediately asked that they always pass along any books they planned to throw away. It was this very book, after all, that had helped Marin pass her interview, and now it was being given to her as a gift. Truly, it was a fortunate book for her. Having secured the position at last, Marin returned home to find her mother had waited up long into the night. The woman remarked that her daughter must be worn out from the work, to which Marin shook her head. Because she had come home so late, she asked her mother to wait a moment while she put things in order, so she could finally sit and read. Worry seized her, however, at the sight of her mother, who had still not eaten anything. Striking up conversation, she invited her mother to come see what she had brought home. There before them sat a basket overflowing with good things: bread, sweets, meat, milk, every last item that had been absent from their home for far too long. Her mother stared at her daughter in bewilderment, unable to comprehend what any of it meant or how she had come by so much. She began to fear that her daughter had gone and borrowed money from someone on her behalf. Marin was quick to deny it, and at last delivered the news they had both been waiting for. She had been given a position at the Duke's estate, and her mother immediately recognized that her daughter was speaking of the illustrious House of Bynes. Smiling warmly, the young woman explained that it was also the home of the Duke of the West, and that as a welcoming gesture, they had presented her with a basket of food. Unable to hold back her tears, the mother was overcome with joy. She had always known the ducal family to be trustworthy, especially the renowned Duke Bynes. It had been so very long since the girl had seen her mother wear such a radiant smile, for ever since the accident, the woman had even stopped praying. And yet there she was, offering thanks to God without ceasing over Marin's new position. However, one detail she would have to confess. She admitted that she had been forced to lie, claiming to be a commoner, and was immediately scolded for it. Flustered, Marin explained that had she revealed the truth of her noble origins, there would have been no interview at all, since young ladies were forever attempting to get close to Gerald for reasons of their own. It was for precisely that reason that, before meeting the heroine of the original story, he had never kept anyone's company. She had even assumed beforehand that this was merely the author's exaggeration. But now that she stood so close to him, she could understand completely why he kept women at a distance. Trying to steer the conversation elsewhere, she asked her mother not to worry too much about it, especially since her intention was to resign the moment she had saved a certain sum of money. And her mother made no move to talk her out of it. The woman trusted her dear Marin, who was pouring everything she had into making their lives better. And our girl knew it well. Once the Duke met the protagonist, he would regain his sight and would naturally have no further need of her. The last thing our heroine wanted was to become entangled in the events of the original novel, or to find herself caught up in trouble. All she needed was enough money to live quietly alongside her mother. The very first thing she planned to do was purchase a larger home with a garden full of her mother's favorite flowers. She had even convinced herself she need not stay on permanently, and felt certain she could endure it for 6 months at most. What she never anticipated was that on the very next day, the moment she arrived at her new workplace, the poor girl would be sent straight back home. Olive explained with some awkwardness that it would be best for her to take the day off. The young man was as polite as he could manage, assuring her that it would be better if she went home that day, and the day after, and the day after that. Marin could not make sense of any of it, for she had only just been personally hired by the Duke the day before. She asked whether she had been dismissed. She simply could not bring herself to believe it. Crumpling to the floor, she could not just leave after everything she had gone through to get there, and swearing she would sooner perish on the spot than accept it. Olive moved to calm her and assured her that was not the issue at all. While she was still trying to make sense of the situation, the Duke opened the door and called them both inside. She had not even realized he was in there, and she quietly cursed herself for having caused such a commotion directly outside his office. The Duke was as composed as ever, yet a blood-stained cloth sat on the desk before him. The girl's eyes went wide at once. That scent was one she knew all too well, unmistakably blood, and it instantly conjured the memory of a carriage accident that would never leave her. The sound of horses reached her ears and she recalled the drops of blood falling before her eyes, but she fought to steady herself, determined not to falter in front of her new employer. Both men regarded her while our Marin strained with every fiber of her being not to collapse on the spot. And then a strange question struck her like a blow. Why did she crave death so desperately? Gerald asked whether he had truly said he wished to die in the palace. Mortified, Marin explained that she had not meant it in that way, and Olive even offered his employer an apology on her behalf. He explained that he had been unable to tell her about the Duke's condition, and had only been attempting to send her home with care. But the girl had assumed she was being dismissed, which was what had caused the scene. Once more, the servant apologized. Marin apologized as well, despite having known nothing of the matter. Gerald remained silent, simply taking stock of the situation. At last, he turned to the servant and said that the girl could begin work that very day, if she was truly willing. Upon hearing those words and pressed by Olive, who was anxious about his master's health, Marin concluded that the smell of blood must be coming from the Duke's injury, and Gerald ordered the young man to stop insisting and to hand over the reports so they could get on with things. The servant obediently passed the important documents to the girl and indicated where she ought to begin reading. Left alone with the Duke, Marin braced herself to start, though her voice trembled, her whole body shaking with nerves. Gerald asked whether she truly intended to read the reports while planted at the doorway, to which she replied that she genuinely felt more at ease there. Naturally, she could never say so out loud, but the very thought of drawing any closer to him was more than her nerves could take. He appeared to pay her answer no mind, and in the next instant stepped toward her, the suddenness of his approach catching the girl entirely off guard. Just as the day before, the young man took hold of her hand, now close enough to sense even Marin's breath. In truth, Gerald wished for her to come even closer, but that single gesture alone was enough to set her heart racing all the faster. The nearer he drew, the further Marin retreated, until she pulled away entirely, crying out directly into the poor young man's face. She knew she ought not to have made such a sound, but she could not contain the anxiety welling up inside her. The Duke addressed her in a calm voice, and Marin pleaded with him to tell her what he wanted, even though she could barely manage to stand upright. Then he asked her plainly why she had been deliberately suppressing her own sounds. Caught completely off guard, she found herself admitting that she had stifled her scream because she knew a loud voice would be painfully grating to her employer's ears. He asked whether shrieking in fright was not a perfectly natural reaction, and she agreed that it certainly was, though her voice had not yet stopped trembling. Knowing she could not afford another misstep, she carefully explained that the Duke had difficulty with his vision. For that reason, she reasoned, he must be highly sensitive to sound, and she apologized accordingly. She tried her best not to look at Gerald as he continued working to determine exactly who the girl standing before him truly was. He found it impossible to accept that a maid would know the secrets of the Bynes family, yet he had drawn that conclusion far too hastily. Seeking to close the subject, he remarked that it was a perceptive observation, and that seemed to ease Marin's nerves a little. At that moment, light from outside spilled into the room through a gap where the curtain had been drawn back. Strange, she thought, since everything in there was always kept tightly shut, and Gerald's silhouette was washed in a glow she had never seen on him before. It was almost difficult to believe how much more handsome he looked in the light. Peering closer, however, Marin noticed something peculiar near the young man's ear. It was unmistakably blood. Nothing else could be confused for it, showing plainly through the black mask. Marin was startled for a moment, but she gathered her courage and resolved to ask what was happening to him. She stammered that blood was seeping from his ear and wondered aloud whether that was where the Duke had been injured. But if the smell of blood was this strong, just how serious could the wound possibly be? The young man only replied that it was nothing. Even so, our girl pressed him, insisting that the wound needed to be treated at once. He explained that it would heal within a day, though the way he said it only made her all the more curious. What exactly did he mean by that? She recalled Olive's words about how the Duke never tended to his wounds, as though they were of no consequence. And this only deepened her conviction that he must understand the reason behind his own bleeding. Looked at that way, the two of them were really not so different. Yet Gerald maintained that he already knew why he was bleeding, and that the matter was of no concern to him, which surprised Marin more than a little. At last, he revealed to his new employee that someone had pierced his ears, a disclosure that sent the girl completely off balance, leaving her wondering who could have done such a thing and hoping the Duke would tell her the truth. As luck or misfortune would have it, he did, confessing that he himself had been the one to commit this brutal act. How could Gerald have ever brought himself to pierce his own ears? Was it possible that the sounds overwhelming him had simply become too much to bear? She thought that if even a small knife cut on a finger was already painful, then what unbearable agony must he have been enduring to drive him to such an extreme? All this time, our heroine had been utterly and completely mistaken. When it came down to it, Duke Gerald, just like her mother, was not merely a character lifted from the pages of a novel. He was a real person of flesh and blood, fully capable of feeling pain. And yet, for reasons she could not quite explain, she had been treating his suffering as though it were of no consequence at all. Shame washed over Marin as she realized she had been viewing his pain as nothing more than background information from a story. And she found herself thinking that the Duke must have been terrified and utterly lost in darkness the day his sight disappeared, and he could no longer be the man he once was. The silence between them shattered when Gerald posed a quiet, pointed question. Why? Tears gathered in Marin's eyes. She fought desperately to keep her composure. Yet the Duke's senses were razor-sharp, and so he asked why she was crying upon hearing about his injury. Before she could form any kind of answer, Olive stepped into the office with a fresh set of urgent reports and greeted them both with brisk efficiency. He explained that the new documents required immediate attention, and asked Marin to take charge of the important papers along with the remaining reports, a task she was more than willing to accept. She had been rescued just in time. Fully aware that her work was what mattered most in that room, she threw herself into the reports, and into the ones that followed after those. Reading aloud in a calm, measured voice, she worked through every document, drawing out the most critical details with the polish of the gifted voice actress she had once been in her former life. When the final page had been read, she bid him farewell, told him she would return with the next batch, and wished him a proper rest. Yet at the very moment she turned to leave, Gerald's hand shot out and caught her slender wrist, holding her in place before she could step out of the office. His first words were a remark that the poor girl's wrist looked no thicker than a twig, an observation she found rather disagreeable. Stiffening slightly, she protested that comparing someone's wrist to a branch was quite the exaggeration, to which he simply replied with a direct order to put on weight. He added that once she had managed to gain a few pounds, she should come back and let him check. The Duke's words were more than a little strange, and our heroine could scarcely believe he was actually pressuring her to eat more. But she had no real choice but to go along with it. The only thing on her mind now was getting out of that office as fast as her legs could carry her. Still bewildered by the entire exchange, Marin moved to leave, wondering privately whether the other assistants were subjected to these peculiar inspections as well. The moment the door shut behind her and Gerald was left alone with his thoughts, he arrived at a quiet conclusion. This woman was something else entirely. What he meant, naturally, was that he was certain she feared him, and yet she had wept openly over his wound, making no effort to hide the sincerity of her feelings. Kay had prepared a full investigation report, and according to its findings, the true identity of the young lady Marin Schwanz was that of a viscount's daughter. He now also knew that following the death of her eldest brother in a carriage accident, her family had fallen into complete ruin. She lived in a crumbling house tending to her sick mother, with neither a husband nor a single suitor to speak of. On the surface, she was a woman with no secrets and nothing particularly noteworthy about her. And yet, for some reason, she stood before him without a trace of fear. Gerald had already come to see Marin as someone genuinely unpredictable, and that quality made her far too dangerous to have close. Walking the corridors and still turning over the Duke's odd remark about her arm, Our heroine had no way of knowing that the young man sat alone in his room at that very moment, smiling quietly to himself. He knew he was venturing into dangerous territory, and yet he was far too fascinated to pull back. A while later, Olive led her to her new office, a remarkably spacious and elegantly appointed room, and he explained that beyond her reporting sessions with the Duke, she would also be expected to assist him with work there, and would have a desk of her very own. The desk was beautiful, and the mere thought of using fine furniture again after such a long absence sent Marin's heart fluttering with something close to joy. She stood there gazing at it, unable to keep the delight from her face. Then she decided to ask whether leaving Gerald's wound untreated would cause any real problem. Olive confessed at once that he had been quietly worrying about that. He said he wished the Duke would agree to some form of treatment, but that the man had a deep and genuine aversion to anyone touching his body. Marin cautioned that the wound could still become inflamed, and Olive agreed, going so far as to mention that Gerald slept very poorly, which would only slow his recovery further. She had had no idea he was struggling to sleep at all. Nothing in the novel had ever mentioned the Duke's sleep troubles, and she suspected it might be connected to the sharpening of his other senses following the loss of his sight. If something could be done to address that, his vision might even return, and with it, everything in his world would be transformed. She set those thoughts aside, however, reminding herself that it was the story's heroine who was meant to help the male lead reclaim his sight, and it was not her place to interfere with that. Even so, she suggested to Olive that he try offering the Duke a small glass of warm wine before bed, explaining that her mother always turned to it when sleep refused to come. Olive was skeptical, having never heard that a warm drink with alcohol could genuinely help someone settle down and drift off. Seizing the opening, Marin told Olive that since she was a commoner, there was no need for all the formality between them, an arrangement he accepted willingly, inviting her to address him by his given name. With that settled, Olive reappeared carrying an enormous tower of documents, and with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely relished hard work, he announced it was time to begin. Marin privately thought she might have to give up any hope of having a lenient superior, because she had never in her life encountered such a staggering mountain of paperwork. She worked without a moment's rest deep into the night, until her hands had gone numb from writing and her mind could no longer string two coherent thoughts together. She only surfaced from the haze when Olive set some sweets in front of her that looked positively irresistible, he remarking that she must be famished after working so hard. He even mentioned that if she found she hadn't had enough to eat, she could always ask him to bring more, an offer she promptly declined. There was already far more than enough, but the young man pointed out that Gerald had personally ordered her to put on weight, so she was to do her best to eat as much as she could manage. She agreed, though Marin thought privately that eating all of it in one sitting would very likely make her ill. But from the moment the first bite touched her lips, her eyes went wide. It was extraordinary. She found her thoughts drifting to her mother, and so she asked Olive to wrap a portion of the sweets for her to take home, apologizing for making yet another request when he had already been so generous. That was no trouble whatsoever, Olive said, agreeing without hesitation, and promising to ask the kitchen to put together a proper parcel for her to bring home. The sound of someone clearing his throat floated in from just outside the office. It was the head butler, a man she had not yet had occasion to meet in person, and Olive welcomed him inside. His name was Sebas, and he carried himself with a gravity that made him seem as solid as a wardrobe, though that impression softened the moment his face broke open into a warm, easy smile. The head butler's nephew had recently been married, and Olive inquired whether the ceremony had gone well, to which Sebas replied that it had, though it had passed far too quickly for his liking. In the story, this distinguished figure was someone who regarded the Duke with absolute and unwavering admiration. He had, in fact, once served as the commander of Gerald's Night Order. When asked what had brought him, Sebas explained that he had simply wished to offer his personal gratitude to the Duke directly. Olive acknowledged this with understanding but gently indicated that such a visit was unlikely to happen that particular day, quietly putting out that hope. The girl watched everything without a word. It was immediately clear that Olive carried real authority within the household. Even the senior staff needed his approval before they could gain direct access to the Duke. That was when the young attendant realized he had neglected to introduce our heroine, and so he presented her as his assistant, Marin, explaining that she had been appointed to a special staff role with direct reporting access to the Duke, and then formally introduced her to the head butler. Sebas broke into a warm smile, expressing his genuine pleasure at the meeting and telling her to think of him simply as Butler Sebas. The young attendant made no attempt to hide the fact that Marin's reading ability was so exceptional it had earned the Duke's direct approval, a revelation that left Sebas visibly astonished. A slightly strained smile appeared on our heroine's face. It was not every day one heard that one's employer had taken a genuine liking to listening to someone read through stacks of reports aloud. The head butler suddenly reached out and took our heroine's hands in both of his, he declaring that if even the Duke himself was impressed with her, she must be a truly remarkable individual, and adding that if she ever found herself in need of anything, she had only to come to him. She thanked him, though she still felt somewhat flustered by the whole exchange. The man projected an almost overwhelming warmth, but the encounter reminded her more clearly than ever that she could not allow her deception to unravel. Because if the Duke's devoted admirers ever discovered the truth, she would be utterly finished. As darkness finally settled over the castle that night, Gerald remained absorbed in thought in his office until the door opened and a familiar voice called to him. It was Olive, who had come to look in on his master and was visibly taken aback to find him still awake. For that very reason, he pressed the Duke to get some sleep tonight, pointing out that he had now been awake for several days running, and that it was clearly starting to wear on him. Acting on Marin's earlier suggestion, he had brought along a cup of warm wine. Gerald naturally caught the scent immediately and asked whether his attendant genuinely believed that would be enough to help him sleep. The young man admitting openly that he had decided to bring this on the strength of Marin's recommendation, which prompted a mild look of surprise from the Duke. After all, she was only a temporary hire. As he poured the wine, however, Olive explained that our heroine had shared with him that her mother drank it whenever sleep refused to come. When the Duke asked where she was now, the attendant replied that she had left some time ago, since it was already quite late. The Duke held the glass without drinking, regarding it with a certain reserve. Taking advantage of the quiet moment alone together, Olive remarked that there was something a little puzzling about Miss Marin, the fact that she was literate, and that her mother drank wine of all things. The very way she held a teacup hinted at a refined upbringing, and he noted that she really did not come across as a commoner in the least. Since the Duke had known from early on that the girl was the daughter of a bankrupt viscount, he chose to share this with Olive, who responded by speculating that her goal was probably nothing more than money, and that her situation must be truly desperate for her to have gone as far as falsifying her records. But who could really say? She was the kind of person others were drawn to without quite being able to explain why. And that was precisely what made Gerald unable to shake the nagging suspicion that she might possess the genuine instincts of a trained spy. He brought the warm wine to his lips and took a small sip, feeling the tension in his body ease just slightly. It had been quite a while since he had last had a drink, and he admitted quietly that it was not bad. Meanwhile, Marin was making her way home with a basket brimming with food, a quiet smile of contentment on her face. She felt a sincere gratitude toward the kitchen staff for the care they had clearly put into it, and was glad she had raised the matter with Olive when she had. Beyond that, our heroine had also been noticing that her mother's appetite had been gradually improving, which only strengthened her resolve to make sure the woman was kept well fed with food that would do her good. Nearly home and lost in thought about how much harder she would need to work to earn more money, she was suddenly pulled back to the present by something that caught her eye. The front door was standing wide open for no apparent reason. Such sudden, crushing dread came over Marin that she let the food basket slip from her hands without a second thought. She rushed into the shack to check on her mother, only to find the entire place turned completely upside down. She had no idea what had taken place, but every instinct told her it was something terrible. At last, she heard it. Her mother's voice drifting from the back room, a desperate, pleading cry calling out for her daughter. Our heroine's heart hammered in her chest as she bolted in a panic toward her mother's room. She called out, asking if she was all right, frantically searching until she found her now. Slumped on the floor, hair in complete disarray, clinging to the wardrobe for support. In a trembling voice, her mother explained how the landlord's wife had arrived, having convinced herself that Marin was her husband's mistress. The woman had proceeded to smash everything within reach, hurl a torrent of accusations, and issue a warning that if the rent was not paid by the very next day, they would have to vacate immediately. Her mother offered a tearful apology, but our girl did everything in her power to reassure her, making it absolutely clear that none of what had happened was her fault in the slightest. Heartbreakingly, the poor woman had managed to save nothing but the vanity table, the one precious keepsake left behind by our heroine's late father. Even so, Marin made it plain beyond any doubt that not a single thing that had transpired in that room was her mother's doing. Deep down, she was certain the blame fell entirely on her own shoulders. She felt she could have acted far sooner and that she should have confronted the landlord's advances head-on rather than simply turning a blind eye. Only one option remained. She was employed at the Duke's estate, and it was there she would have to turn for help. With that decided, she declared that she would go to the castle at once to put an end to the situation. It was deep in the night when Marin appeared at the gates of the Duke's manor, her heart full of anxiety about whether anyone would even allow her entry. The guard stepped forward immediately, demanding to know who she was. She introduced herself and explained that she worked under Master Olive and needed to speak with him as a matter of urgency. One of the knights raised an eyebrow upon hearing she worked for the master's assistant. This was the first time any of them had ever laid eyes on her. He turned to his colleague Ubis and asked whether the man had any knowledge of someone who claimed to work directly under Olive. The young man studied her carefully, searching his memory for any sign of recognition, but he truly had no idea who Marin was. They huddled together in low voices, trying to determine whether either of them at least knew who Olive was. But it turned out Ubis had no idea what the attendant even looked like. In short, neither of them knew anything about any of it whatsoever. Without warning, the red-haired young man broke away from the conversation at a sprint, ignoring his partner's shouts demanding he come back. Flushing with embarrassment, the remaining knight apologized to our heroine and explained that his colleague was still very green, then resolved that he would personally go and verify the situation before giving her any answer about being let in. Once she was finally admitted, our girl was left to wait in anxious silence in the reception room. Thankfully, the head butler was able to confirm her identity right away and immediately asked whether she wished to see Olive, which made her exhale in sheer, undisguised relief. Surprised by her unexpected appearance, Olive came to find her and asked what pressing matter had brought her to the estate at such an hour. She greeted him with due formality before cutting straight to the point, acknowledging that she had been employed for only a single day, yet finding herself in the position of needing a 1-week advance on her wages. In desperation, she confessed that the landlord had threatened to force them out the very next day if the rent was not paid, and stressed that her mother was gravely ill and simply could not endure such instability. She was on the verge of breaking into tears right there in front of Olive, but the young man told her to collect herself and hold her head high, because he, personally, was willing to help her that very moment, though he made clear that any decision concerning wages rested entirely with the Duke. He therefore suggested they first go and report everything to Gerald, so the Duke would be fully informed of the situation. Standing just outside the office, Olive called to his master and explained that there was an urgent matter concerning Marin. True to form, Gerald told them to enter, for he invariably seemed to sense the moment something of consequence was unfolding. For some reason, however, Olive then instructed her to take the candle, which left our heroine puzzled, given that he was always the one to step through the door first. The answer was simple. This time the Duke had called for her alone, which meant the young man was not permitted to follow her inside. Marin had never heard anyone speak her name quite like that, and this was the first time the Duke had ever chosen to speak with her privately, without his assistant by his side. Somewhat flustered, she did as she was told, stepped into the office, offered her apologies for disturbing him at the stroke of midnight, to which the Duke responded at once, asking in a direct, measured tone what had happened. Deeply mortified, she apologized for the trouble she was causing her new employer, before asking whether she might receive a 1-week advance on her salary. Gerald fell silent for a long moment, seemingly weighing the matter, as though verifying he had heard correctly, before at last posing the question. Why should he approve such a request when he had no assurance she would remain in his employ? She had absolutely nothing to offer him in return. That was the blunt truth of it, and it knocked her completely off balance. Our heroine's eyes went wide as she scrambled desperately for anything to say. After all, what on earth could a penniless woman like herself possibly offer someone like the Duke? Then her gaze fell upon a glass of red wine sitting nearby, and something clicked. She remembered that it had been her own idea, a method she herself had proposed to Olive not long ago. Without a moment's hesitation, she announced that she would help him sleep, and that this, she declared, was the greatest thing she could offer him. She explained that she not only had a thorough grasp of written reports, but was also an exceptionally skilled reader aloud, going so far as to mention that her mother had always found it far easier to drift off whenever she read beside her. The Duke's voice held genuine surprise as he asked how our heroine had known he had trouble sleeping, and whether his assistant had truly gone and told her everything. Doing her best to shield the poor young man from any blame, she confirmed it, but made certain to add that Olive had spoken with nothing but good intentions, driven by sincere concern for the Duke's well-being. To everyone's astonishment, the Duke agreed to her proposal, and she even had to ask him to repeat himself just to be certain she had heard correctly. He said it again, plainly stating that the two of them could retire right now. All that remained for Marin was to carry out her most important mission, to lull the Duke into sleep, and in doing so, finally secure help for her mother. That particular choice of words left our heroine thoroughly bewildered. She had not said anything wrong, of course, but the phrasing did land in a rather peculiar way. In this humble narrator's opinion, she seemed rather more enthusiastic than necessary about the prospect of sleeping beside him. He asked how long the journey from the castle to her home would take, and she replied that it was roughly an hour's walk to the cottage. That was a considerable distance, and so Gerald told her she would need to relocate, then called for Olive, who stumbled into the office looking thoroughly flustered, and requested that temporary lodgings be arranged in the servants' quarters by the following morning, with the additional stipulation that since she had family, everything must be organized so they could all live together. This meant that Marin would now be able to live within the Duke's castle alongside her ailing mother, and the joy that welled up inside her was simply beyond measure. On top of that, the master ordered that her advance payment be handed over to her immediately, which left our heroine completely stunned, for she would now have not only money, but a permanent roof over their heads. Overwhelmed with gratitude, she called out to him and thanked him with every ounce of sincerity she possessed. Her eyes shone more brightly than they ever had in her life. With all of that settled, Olive ushered the girl back to the office to go over the details and practicalities of the move, leaving Gerald alone with his thoughts. Having someone read him to sleep, that was all he required. From this point forward, Marin would serve as a kind of nursemaid. The young man found himself quietly curious about what was turning over inside that small head of hers. But now that she would be living in the castle, he knew the opportunity to uncover every one of her secrets would come soon enough. Olive had arranged the finest horse available for her that evening, and Marin thanked the animal warmly with gentle pats, calling it a good girl. At home, her mother asked how the visit to the castle had gone and whose horse that was standing outside. But Marin was far more concerned about her mother catching a chill, and explained that since the hour was already so late, the people there had lent her the horse to get home safely. But that was not the important part. Marin had wonderful news. She announced that the two of them would be moving. But before she could even finish her sentence, the woman's face fell into despair. She was certain they had nowhere else to go. Our girl gently cut her off, taking her mother by the hands and explaining that the Duke himself had given them lodgings in the servants' quarters where they could live together, and that a carriage would be sent the very next morning so her mother could travel in comfort, and all their belongings could be taken along as well. The lady could barely bring herself to believe it. She expressed profound gratitude toward Duke Bynes, who had shown himself to be a true guardian of the people of the West by extending his help to Marin without a moment's hesitation. It had been so long since our girl had last seen her mother smile with such genuine happiness, and the lady could not even begin to fathom how she could ever repay such kindness. Enormously relieved, our heroine reflected that she had never truly believed the day would come when they would finally leave that wretched little hovel behind. Yet here it was, arrived at last. The following morning, birds were singing brightly in the crisp air, until they were suddenly startled into flight by the sound of someone screaming at another to hurry up. That someone turned out to be Marin and her mother's landlord. His wife's relentless shrieking carried across the yard, her insistence that at this rate she would never collect a single coin of what she was owed. Worn down and exasperated, the man pointed out that his wife was well aware of their situation and demanded to know how they were supposed to pull that sum together in a single day, to which she screamed back that she had no intention of going after the money at all, but rather to yank out that girl's hair by the roots, because doing the same to the mother alone would never be enough to satisfy her. Even so, Giorno pressed on, arguing that no one in their right mind would want to rent such a hovel, and that if those two left, finding a replacement tenant for that ramshackle cottage would be nearly impossible. This sent the woman into an absolute fury, as she screamed at him, demanding to know who exactly he thought she was doing all of this for, insisting it was because of his affair with Marin, though he flatly and repeatedly denied it. His wife remained utterly convinced that Giorno was still trying to shield Marin even after everything that had come to pass, brushing aside his every denial, until he spotted what he thought was the perfect moment to slip away. Catching sight of Marin standing right in front of the house, he shouted at his wife to look over there. It was no accident that Marin was waiting there for them. And once that woman realized it, a vicious smile spread across her face as she declared that the little wretch looked ready to have every last strand of hair ripped from her head then and there. The landlord and his wife advanced on the girl together, who looked positively tiny, standing before the two of them. Giorno's wife was fully convinced the girl had brought the money in full. But for some reason, Marin's expression held not even the faintest trace of friendliness. She dropped a black pouch onto the ground between them, heavy with silver coins, more than enough to cover every last coin of rent owed. The man could not believe she had managed to produce such a sum, and his wife was absolutely certain there was only one way a girl could earn that much money in a single night, she declaring loudly that she had obviously sold her body to do it. But Marin had no intention of standing there and absorbing any of that in silence. Our heroine hauled back and struck that wretched woman across the face with every ounce of strength she possessed, pouring every last drop of her pent-up fury into that single blow. The lady had clearly not anticipated being struck by someone like our heroine, and in a state of pure, incandescent outrage, she shrieked, demanding to know whether the little wretch had completely lost her mind. But none of that mattered to Marin right now. What she wanted answered was how that woman had dared to raise her hand against her own mother, a woman who had been gravely ill for such a long time. Judging by his expression, this appeared to be news to Giorno as well, who demanded to know what on earth she was talking about. Now it was finally time for Marin to deal with that useless man, and she turned and struck him across the face with every last bit of strength she had left. Before he could even process what had just happened, she made it unmistakably clear that he had always been the root cause of every single problem here, and our heroine demanded to know whether he truly thought she would never find out exactly who Giorno had been sneaking around with behind his wife's back. The mere mention of Wendy's name was all it took to make his eyes go wide. He had been caught. His wife turned on him with blazing fury, demanding to know what that name had to do with anything. For it was Wendy herself who had come to her and claimed that he was having an affair with Marin. Even with the evidence staring him in the face, he thrashed about in denial, desperately trying to claw his way out of the accusation by any means he could. The moment she learned of her husband's betrayal, the very man who had just stood there calling his mistress beautiful and perfect to her face, his wife seized him by the hair and refused to let go. As could be expected, Giorno's fury fell squarely on Marin, for it was entirely because of her that his wife had managed to uncover the name of his true mistress. But a third hand shot out and caught his arm, its owner immediately demanding to know what was going on. It was Sebas, and one glance was all he needed to understand that what stood before him was no ordinary domestic dispute. The mayor and his wife went rigid, suddenly aware that the man before them was not someone to be trifled with. Sebas exhaled slowly, the weight of the entire scene settling on him with palpable weariness. He greeted Marin with a composed smile, and just beyond him, a breathtakingly grand white carriage with gilded trim rolled into view. The head butler announced that he had come personally to escort both her and her mother. Marin had not expected this at all. When they had spoken of sending a carriage, she had never imagined Sebas would come himself, much less at such an early hour. The carriage was so magnificent that the people of the neighborhood could not look away, drawn in by the spectacle unfolding before them. Sebas had arrived at precisely the right moment, almost as though he had sensed that our heroine would need him. The mayor and his wife stared at the man with open fear, unable to piece together what they were witnessing. Facing them both with grave composure, Sebas announced that he had arrived at the most opportune moment to set the record straight. A brazen smirk crossed the insufferable woman's face as she declared that she finally understood where all that money had come from. She was convinced the girl had wrapped some wealthy old man around her finger, and that this was the only explanation for how she had managed to repay her debts. The head butler found neither of them the least bit entertaining, and so he stated plainly that this property was the domain of Duke Bynes, just as the mountain itself belonged to the Duke's estate. With measured authority, he turned to the man and asked whether he had secured the Duke's permission before constructing that cottage and helping himself to years of collected rent. Swallowing nervously, Giorno admitted that the Duke had once given word that a small shelter could be built there for hunters passing through, which meant that His Grace had permitted only the use of the space, free of charge, and had said absolutely nothing about anyone collecting rent from it. His wife shrieked and started in with threats, demanding to know how he dared say such things or invoke the Duke's name, because neither of them had for a single moment imagined that the actual head butler of House Bynes was standing right before them. With one snap of his fingers, Sebas had the pair surrounded, and commanding his attendants to take those insufferably presumptuous individuals away at once. At that, the landlord's wife collapsed at his feet, sobbing through a confession of every sin she could name, begging for mercy, and vowing that she would apologize to Marin if only they would spare her. It was only now, with everything against her and her home on the line, that she had thought to grovel. Our girl looked on with steady eyes and felt not the slightest impulse to intercede on behalf of the woman who had raised her hand against her mother. She wanted that woman to answer for every single thing she had done. Still, the landlord's wife wailed and threw herself at their mercy, but she had left it far too late for that. With the matter wrapped up, Sebas turned to Marin and asked when she had realized that rent could not legally be collected in that area, and she told him frankly that she had known from the very start. Even so, she had gone on paying every month simply to guarantee herself a place to stay, as nowhere cheaper could be found anywhere in the area. And so she had held her tongue and said nothing. Everything changed, however, the moment they laid hands on her mother, and that was something she would never let pass in silence. She could not forgive them for what they had done to Rowena, and watching the pair being led away by the Duke's attendants gave her a quiet, deep satisfaction. With that chapter finally closed, Marin thought it only right to properly introduce her mother and Sebas to one another. Rowena stepped forward shortly after, offering the head butler a graceful bow and introducing herself by name. He was visibly taken aback by the elegance of her bearing, and found himself thinking that perhaps the assistant had not been wrong after all. Sebas quietly concluded that the Duke must already be aware of Marin's deception, and had kept her on for reasons he intended to understand in due time. The only item they had left to their name was an antique vanity table, which the Duke's attendants carefully carried out on their behalf. At last, Marin helped her mother into the carriage, while she herself chose to ride the horse she had borrowed the night before, promising to take good care on the road. Sebas had already heard about the horse from the assistant, and Marin placed her mother's care in his hands for the journey ahead. She was confident Rowena could not be in better company, and she watched the two of them depart with a quiet smile on her lips. In that moment, she knew with certainty that she would never set foot in that place again. A far better life was waiting, for both her and her mother. Olive welcomed them with a bright, open smile and led Marin to her new room, asking whether it was to her liking. He explained that it was the room with the finest sunlight in the building, one that the Duke had set aside especially for Marin and her mother. Rowena could scarcely believe that a servant's room could look like this, and our heroine had to admit that it bore no resemblance to one whatsoever. Olive explained that the entire third floor of the servants' quarters had been cleared out just for them, but they were welcome to choose whichever one they preferred. For Rowena, however, the choice was no choice at all. She made it clear that if she could, she would gladly live here for the rest of her days. Marin asked for the room right beside her mother's, and the two of them were so overcome with happiness they could barely believe any of it was real. Their conversation came to a gentle stop as the door opened to reveal a red-haired maid named Yuria, who introduced herself as the personal attendant assigned to them from that day forward. Marin was genuinely surprised that they had been given a dedicated maid at all, and beyond that, the girl's striking red hair stirred a feeling of inexplicable familiarity. They welcomed Yuria warmly, and Marin made a point of introducing her mother. Beaming with a sincere smile, the maid said she was truly glad to be in their service. Our heroine asked her, however, not to address her as my lady. She wanted the two of them to speak as friends would. Yuria smiled and agreed to do her best, though she immediately slipped and called her Miss Marin out of sheer habit. She caught herself at once and laughed, acknowledging that dropping formal speech was harder than it sounded, but promised to make it up to them with a proper meal in the meantime. Yuria had a warmth about her that was immediately endearing, and Marin told her simply to call her whatever came naturally, without worrying over it. Once everything had been laid out on the table, the maid reminded her that when they had finished eating, they need only leave the dishes where they were. She also made a point that if there was anything she needed at any hour, ring the bell beside the table. With that, Olive too excused himself and stepped out. The moment the two of them settled into their chairs at that beautifully set table, the smiles on their faces simply would not leave. Everything about the scene was utterly wonderful. Then, quite without warning, a shadow crossed Rowena's expression, and her daughter caught it immediately. Marin asked what was troubling her, and it was clear that something had been weighing on her mother's heart about this new life from the moment they arrived. Rowena confessed that she had been so swept up in the Duke's extraordinary generosity that she had let herself forget who he really was, and she feared what would happen to them if their deception were ever discovered. Our girl knew her mother was not wrong. The day that lie came to light, they would find themselves in the very same position as Giorno and his wife. All of that goodwill would be swept away in an instant, and Marin could easily find herself stripped of her role as assistant, and ultimately thrown back out into the street with nothing. Even so, she told her mother not to dwell on it, and gave her word that she would do everything within her power to make herself genuinely indispensable to the Duke. Speaking of whom, at that very moment, the young man was receiving a full account of how the girl had handled the landlord and his wife, and a faint, involuntary smile crossed Gerald's lips, leaving everyone in the room utterly stunned. Not one of them could remember the last time they had seen their master smile like that. Composing himself, however, the Duke handed down his judgment without hesitation. The assets were to be confiscated. The two were to serve 5 years of hard labor, and a full investigation was to be carried out to ensure the law was applied equally and without exception. And as for the woman who had struck Marin's mother, since she had done so without knowing the woman was of noble birth, the Duke ordered that her hands be permanently removed. With that, both attendants withdrew from the office, leaving the young man entirely alone. It seemed that every time he managed to relax a little, his senses exploded over something. His head seemed about to burst, and even his own sounds became an arrow that exploded in his ears. Even when he bit his lips to contain the moans, the taste of blood already made him sick. Lost in thought, the Duke realized he couldn't even remember the last time he had slept. He even wondered if it made sense to endure all that. Honestly, maybe it would be better to just die. It would certainly be easier. However, Marin's words came to his mind like a light. The girl had promised to help him fall asleep. Still, Gerald didn't know if she could really do that since it was something no one had been able to do before. And even if she could, considering that terrible pain seemed to be bursting his head, he needed the girl to do it before he went mad. That day, Marin entered a luxurious library for the first time, and had no idea so many books existed in one place. She was so enchanted she didn't contain her joy and exclaimed that it was incredible. The library was huge and fancy, as expected from the Vine's house, and her heart raced with the smell of old paper and leather she hadn't smelled in a long time. But it wasn't time to lose focus. She needed to choose a book to read to the Duke quickly. Just thinking that if she helped him sleep, she would earn a whole gold coin was already exciting. This was fantastic because she could save a lot of money in just 1 week. The library had everything from philosophy, history, and even a book on herbs that caught Marin's attention. In the original story, the main character cured the Duke's eyes by preparing a remedy with a special herb. The original book only mentioned the name without giving details or explanations. So, she wondered what exactly that magical herb would be. Curious, the MC decided to try to find that plant. While she looked at the index, she searched for the name Mandel Song and didn't even notice she said it out loud. She was so distracted in the search that she didn't notice someone entering and heard a voice ask why she was looking for that specific herb. When she turned around, she saw a new character in front of her and didn't know who it was. Marin looked surprised at the little boy who approached her and asked what she was doing there. With eyes blue as the sky, hair white as snow, and a book in his hands, that boy was incredibly cute. The girl introduced herself somewhat awkwardly, and the child admitted he had already heard about her because of Olive. The little boy's name was Zero, and he politely held out his hand to greet her, and Marin soon caught on to who he was. In the future, he would be a genius of alchemy, and a great friend of the Duke who was the same age as the boy. So Marin didn't understand where that angelic appearance came from, which made anyone feel affection for him. Apparently, what they said about him having drunk a potion to transform someone into a child was true. Even with this small detail, Zero was still very cute. Friendly, the girl shook the boy's hand and said she was very happy to meet Mr. Zero. He touched her fingers gently and kissed her hand like a true nobleman. Marin felt a bit awkward with the gesture since his behavior didn't seem at all like that of a common child. Zero noticed that Lady Marin seemed to be a person quite out of the ordinary, and she was surprised to hear this from a little boy. He comments that the girl was talking to him very formally even though he was a child, and Marin just answered that since she was a commoner, it was natural to speak with respect. but the boy laughed, saying that she had no skill at lying, and this left him very excited. Marin tried to prove she really was a commoner and that she wasn't fooling anyone, but the little boy seemed to already know very well who she was. Even so, he wanted to know why she was looking for the herb called Mandelson, since it would be strange for a common girl to be interested in this subject. Hearing this, Marin asked why he thought that herb was something common, because she knew that a magic potion was made from it. Then Zero explained that this plant grew anywhere, even on the side of the road and in the garden of the Duke's castle, and that it could hardly be considered medicinal. That was the reason he hadn't put the plant in the book. And at that moment, Marin realized that the boy knew the work very well. In fact, he was the author himself, Mr. Zero, an amazing boy with blue eyes. The little boy even showed that his autograph was in the book, and Marin could hardly believe it. So impressive it was. Her admiration leaves Zero mega proud. He was indeed confident about what he knew and was happy she had liked his book. However, the girl soon tried to organize her thoughts, realizing that on the inside, that boy was an adult, and she couldn't forget that. So she decided to take advantage to find out everything about Mandelson with the only person who understood the subject. He was holding another book bound in red velvet and agreed to answer all her questions. Finally, Zero opened to the right page, and there was the illustration of the plant. It was just like the dandelions from Marin's past life, with dark leaves and a yellow flower at the tip. Curious, Marin asked if it really worked as a remedy, but the boy was sure the plant had no special properties besides a refreshing smell that resembled mint. It seemed that no one besides the main character's story knew the true powers of that plant, which left the MC a little upset. Zero also added that the flower wasn't medicinal, but rather poisonous, and he was completely right, because that yellow flower had toxic substances that caused stomach pain. It seemed impossible that it would be useful for anything. For this reason, he had included the plant in a special book he had recently written. That caught Marin by surprise. After all, this current situation was completely different from the original story. She started thinking about the matter and didn't understand how a medicinal plant could be on the kingdom's poison list. Sometime later, the girl and Zero parted ways, but even at a distance, she didn't stop thinking about the plant, trying to figure out where the secret was. This was because in the original novel, the Duke had drunk Mandelson juice, and that had cured his eyes immediately. His total cure was the role of the protagonist of the novel, but now Marin wanted to do something. It didn't have to be much. She just wanted to alleviate the Duke's suffering a little before the meeting of the two using a very small dose. The problem was that using poison against Gerald was much more serious than just telling a lie. Apparently, only the main character would be able to remove the poison from the plant and create the remedy that would restore Gerald's vision. She needed to remember that she had decided from the beginning not to meddle in the lives of the main characters. She was only at that job out of necessity and nothing more. Even so, she felt bad about the fact that Gerald suffered every day with a horrible pain that wouldn't let anyone have a normal life. Marin had already learned everything about his suffering by reading the novel, but she had to pretend she didn't know anything. But even though she wouldn't help him directly, she knew everything would be fine. All she had to do was wait a little longer until the main character appeared. It would be that other person who would save the protagonist, since only she had the power to do so. That night, the girl entered her boss's office and asked if they could postpone the wrist exam because she felt she still wasn't ready. The Duke looked at her with interest and said that she herself had promised to improve a few days ago, and then he held out his hand and asked her to come closer. Of course, our girl had no way to refuse. His gesture was even like that of someone calling a little dog in training to give its paw. But Marin wasn't a trained dog, and Gerald just wanted to check her wrist, which should be improving. He even asked with a smile if the MC wanted to be his pet. While Marin continued to deny it nervously, the Duke found this funny and commented that the girl's wrist was still as fragile as a twig. Irritated, our girl pulled her hand back quickly, with a warning that she wasn't ready yet, but that she would soon gain weight. Then she prepared to read the book she had brought, and asked him to forget about her wrist and pay attention to her voice. She had brought fairy tales on purpose, thinking this would help the boy fall asleep quickly, since it was the best type of book to make anyone fall asleep fast. Dryly, Gerald explained that the more boring the book, the better the dream, and he was happy she had chosen fairy tales and not a silly story with a happy ending. Upon opening the first page, the girl prepared to begin reading and asked the Duke to take a deep breath and relax, or at least try. The tale was about a noble crow that had lived a long time ago, and she read each word with a soft voice. Marin told that one day, while the crow was settling in its nest, a snake began watching it very closely. At that moment, Gerald closed his eyes, concentrating on that calm voice that gave him chills, even though it was the only one capable of truly calming him. The Duke had never heard anything like it. Her voice was so good he felt his body tremble. It seemed he was in another world at that moment, but his consciousness remained there in the darkness of the office, listening to her whisper. Strange questions arose in his head. Why had the girl apologized to him before, and what exactly had she done to apologize for hiding who she was? He felt his senses fail and could no longer think. So, he ordered the girl to stop reading, startling her so much that the poor girl almost dropped the book. Gerald grabbed her by the shoulders quickly, as he loved to do, apparently. He pressed his face against her neck so quickly that she didn't understand anything. To the boy, it was clear that woman had done something to him and completely messed with his head. When Marin realized that the Duke was too close, she gave a startled scream in the Duke's ear, who was too busy questioning if she hadn't used poison against him because it wouldn't be so easy to fall asleep like that. He leaned against the MC's neck, smelling clean grass, sun, and something he was feeling for the first time, the sweet aroma of her skin. The Duke pulled away, admitting his mistake, but his behavior was so strange that not even Marin could believe it. The Duke confidently stated that she had managed to make him sleep just by reading the book, without any poison, something he hadn't felt in a long time. That was music to Marin's ears, who was very happy to have helped the master rest, even if only for an instant. But Gerald didn't want to continue reading, using the excuse that the book wasn't that interesting, which makes the girl suggest going to the library to switch the work. She was sure he would accept. After all, who knows how much time he had spent without sleeping before that. But he refused to rest more. In fact, the boy had a deep fear of falling into too deep a sleep and never waking up again. So he suggested continuing the next day, which left Marin a bit confused. The next day, while she signed the endless documents, Olive asked if it was very difficult to help the boss sleep. Since no one had ever managed to do that before, he asked the MC not to pressure herself so much to be the first. Marin admitted it wasn't easy and told that Gerald even dozed off a bit, but then didn't want to anymore, and Olive didn't believe it at first. He jumped with joy, squeezed hand, and said that was incredible because only the girl had made him doze off, even if for a short time. She had done what no one else had managed, and Olive said she was an amazing girl for that, then gave her some gold. Marin felt a bit awkward about getting money for a short nap, but thanked him from the heart, thinking about the chance she would have the next day. She was even confident about it for a while. But a week later, she was already going crazy because the Duke continued to avoid her. Without understanding the reason for the escape, she wondered why Gerald didn't want to sleep and refused to see her. The girl finished the day's mountain of paperwork, chose several books for him, and still had time to read her own. And now there she was, again in that dark hallway. She was wanting to talk to Gerald, who refused to see her. Then she said for the entire hallway to hear that sleep was a basic human need, and asked how he intended to live suffering like that. Actually, the girl didn't want to talk like that, but she had no choice. It had been days she had been trying to convince him that this was the best and only alternative she had. Finally, the MC shouted at the office door, asking if he was just afraid to sleep, and saying that he should admit his weaknesses to her if he wanted this to work. The next day, Marin walked tired through the hallway with her books, not knowing whether she would be called again or dismissed as always. Until suddenly she heard voices saying that she was someone important and that she was helping the master. Watching from the corner, the MC saw several maids, including Yuria, while the other girls said her mistress was just an ordinary commoner. But Yuria defended Marin willingly, while the others laughed and didn't take her seriously. They surrounded the maid and said they knew the truth about Marin. They knew she had only gone to the palace to sell her own body, and that she would never really help the master. They also spoke ill of her mother, saying she was arrogant and tried to look like a noble. This really bothered our girl. Yuria tried to protect the two at any cost, but the three maids went after her with the worst possible intentions. One of them shouted that the orphan had dared to raise her voice to them and that she needed a lesson. But when she raised her hand to hit Yuria, a book flew and hit her right in the back. The woman, furious and in pain, turned to see who had thrown the object. It was Marin, who irritatedly asked how they had the courage to raise their hand to someone, especially a coworker. She called Yuria, and the maid realized this wasn't going to end well. Quickly, one of the maids grabbed the girl by the hair, saying she wasn't going to get close to the mistress. Luckily, Yuria managed to escape from that mean woman. Already out of patience, Marin stepped in front of her and ordered the girl to stay behind her body to protect her, but the woman didn't back down. In fact, she called Marin, asking how she dared to feel important, and questioning if she thought she was important there just because the Duke had given her a caress. The maid clearly wasn't in the mood for conversation and just wanted to teach the newly arrived employees a lesson. Fearing the worst, Yuria begged Marin not to get involved, promising she would resolve everything alone. But our girl wasn't going to allow her to be treated like that. So she pulled out her book, ready to hit those evil maids. She hit one with the book and then another while the maids advanced on her. Of course, Yuria didn't stay out of it either. The girl ran to defend her mistress and tried to push the girls who were totally out of control. Chaos quickly set in. The maids fought among themselves like teenagers, and the boldest servant pulled Marin's hair. Thus, the rude woman who had called Marin got even more furious when she started to lose in the fight. Then she went after Marin, held her hands, and declared that it was useless to fight, and that it was better for her to be quiet. Yuria even tried to get close to her mistress, but soon after was pushed by another maid. Our protagonist realized she was screwed. She couldn't do anything with one of the maids sitting right on top of her, especially considering the woman's strength. Luckily, the chief maid appeared, asking furiously what all that noise meant. She was face to face with a strange scene. A maid sitting on the floor, all messed up, and a third one mounted on top of Lady Marin. The butler appeared shortly after and was so surprised he could hardly believe what he was seeing. Marin turned around and greeted Sabas as if nothing had happened. Of course, she was lying on the floor, totally disheveled, but she continued to be a polite woman. Nervous, he pushed all the maids away with one hand, and the first thing he did was ask the MC to stand up as quickly as possible. To answering the chief maid's question, Yuria responded, explaining that the other maids called Mrs. Marin and her mother tramps, and that she simply couldn't let it slide. Everyone there knew that the maids should behave in silence, and the butler watched all that without understanding anything. The chief maid didn't even know how the girls dared to say those things. She states that those girls were guests of the Duke and that the maids had just stained the honor of the house. The maids fell silent, realizing the chaos they had caused and the consequences that would come soon. The chief maid page personally apologized to Miss Marin, taking the blame for not having controlled those mindless girls. And she explains that if only she had been insulted, perhaps she could forgive the women, but they had insulted her mother and the MC couldn't forget that. So she suggested that since those maids were so lively, maybe it would be good for them to work in a place where they had to deal with fewer people, like a dump. She asked for close supervision to ensure that abuse against young maids wouldn't happen again, stating this couldn't be allowed at the Duke's house. Yuria's eyes filled with tears for them defending her honor for the first time since she arrived at the palace. Thus, Paige promised to ensure that would never happen again, and reinforced that the girls needed to apologize. With the matter almost resolved, the butler suggested that Marin go see the doctor to make sure everything was okay. Out of nowhere, Olive appeared, also curious to know what had happened after hearing the noise from the hallway. He saw Marin's messy hair, and it was very embarrassing for our girl to appear all flustered in front of her colleague like that. Of course, the boy had no idea what had gone down, but he asked Marin to follow him, warning that the Duke had called her to the office to resolve something urgent. As soon as they entered Gerald's office, the boy asked what had happened, sensing a slight smell of blood. She said she just had a slightly heated conversation with the maids, but Olive added that they was the one who had insulted her and for this reason started a fight. The servant makes it clear that the reason for all this confusion was a comment by the employee about how Marin and her mother were nothing more than courtesans. Hearing this, the Duke ordered Olive to cut out the maids' tongues without thinking twice. Being got scared he would really go that far, she admitted she had already punished the girls by forcing them to work at the dump without asking him first. But he thought she was too merciful for giving such a light punishment. Since this was resolved, Gerald questioned if she had won again, but the expression again sounded strange to her. The heroine realized he was talking about the time she had hit Giorno, although that wasn't something she always did. When the man insisted on the question, Marin sighed and said she hadn't lost. The boy said that he seemed to have brought a real bully into the castle, leaving the girl even more disconcerted. He gives a sideways smile at the MC's reaction, seeming to really have fun at the girl's expense. Playful, he comments that he could tell the girl was all messed up even without being able to see, even though she tried to deny it. Then the Duke approaches and grabs her arm, asking what she was relying on to be so brave and courageous with him. But Marin just looked away and couldn't answer because she always felt strange around him and her heart beat strongly. Changing the subject, Gerald told Olive to get new clothes for the girl since her sleeves were rolled up. She didn't think it was so bad and could solve it herself. Serious, the boy said she just had to accept the gift and asked her not to misunderstand the reason for it, which only left Marin with more questions in her head, not understanding what kind of misunderstanding he meant. Quickly, he sent Olive back to work, and the young man obeyed as usual. The poor protagonist prayed for the boy to take her with him, but suddenly Gerald asked what she was doing, suggesting she should be working since he had noticed the girl had brought a book again. Trying to compose herself, she asks if she could already begin reading, which she had postponed for a long time because of that confusion. But she was surprised when the Duke crossed his arms and said that normally he wasn't afraid of something like that. Marin definitely didn't expect that. She couldn't believe that was happening. The day before, she had shouted in the hallway that he was afraid to sleep, and Gerald certainly had heard her words, even though he had remained silent. Actually, she didn't think he could hear from inside the office, but now she was sure she was completely wrong. Smiling, the Duke suggested she begin reading to see how she would handle things this time. The book she chose was about the Siren Desert, which lay between the Omen Empire and the Sanders Empire, and was the ancient home of thousands of dangerous monsters. It was the duty of the Duke's family to contain the monsters that came out of the desert to ensure the safety of the people. A long time ago, the battle against the monsters had finally ended, and only the remaining warriors needed to return home. But some problems arose. None of the scouts who had been sent on the search returned, so the Duke knew they couldn't advance until they found the missing ones. There was still no news of Henderson, who was a key piece for them. Then one of his men informed him that he had found the cause of the knight's disappearance, but it was something so serious that he would have to see it with his own eyes. The scene was almost magical. The knights had reached a kind of garden with giant flowers. The armored knights stood before monstrous flowers, plants of sinister beauty that deceived their minds until one of the men extended his hand with the steel glove and touched it. The silence of the forest ended with a roar. From the middle of the flower emerged a huge mouth full of teeth, totally terrifying. Gerald had ordered them not to do anything risky, so the knights backed off. The perfume coming from the flowers was very sweet, even burning the Duke's nose, and it was this plant that made people confused. Gerald ordered everyone to cover their noses immediately, not breathe that air, and get out of there so as not to be caught by the monsters. He ordered that the soldiers be taken from there as far as possible, but there were too many monsters for him to solve alone. However, the guy explains that it was difficult for someone to fight with one hand while holding their nose, and only the Duke would be able to do that. Promising his right-hand man he would return soon. While slicing the monster, he imagined that there must be a center in the flower where something controlled its attacks. He was sure that by the way they grew in the garden, the flowers protected it in some way. After cutting many stems, the boy finally found what he wanted: the brain of that terrible monster. He approaches with his sword in hand and finally strikes with the sword exactly in the center of the flower, so that all the other creatures would also die. Gathering all his will, Duke Gerald drove the blade deep into the heart of the plant, making a terrible scream echo, piercing the silence of the forest. At that moment, a flash struck the boy's eyes as if a lightning bolt had fallen in front of him. But even upon opening his eyes, the Duke realized he was still in darkness, and it was on that very day that he became blind. This time the boy managed to fall back asleep, and upon waking, he had no sense of how much time had passed since Marin had last been with him. He could not even recall when he had last dreamed. Beside him was Mr. K, who informed him that the Duke had slept for roughly an hour and that he had remained by his side the entire time. Sleep was truly a wonderful thing. A single hour of rest had been enough to fill his body with renewed energy. As ever, his thoughts drifted to Marin, to how strange and surprising a woman she was, yet also how dangerous, someone capable of both easing his pain and trapping him within it indefinitely. Now the boy was even less certain about what to do where she was concerned. Speaking of Marin, she was still visibly disheveled from the confrontation and knew she had to change her clothes as quickly as possible. She felt she looked terrible, and it came as no surprise that Olive had reacted with such shock upon seeing her. Before she could dwell on it further, however, a knock by Yuria, who had come out of worry and wanted to confirm that her mistress was all right. Marin answered that the Duke had not even scolded her. There was no cause for alarm, and she also made sure to ask whether Yuria herself was doing well. Unfortunately, this sort of hostility and mockery from the other maids was something the girl had experienced many times before and had grown accustomed to. Gently, Marin called the maid by name and took her hand with care, wanting her to feel that she was not alone. She told Yuria made clear that if anyone offended her in the future, she could come straight to her. The MC was prepared to fight for her whenever she needed it. Those words left the girl deeply moved and full of gratitude for the fact that her mistress had stood up for her earlier as well. As far as Marin was concerned, however, there was nothing to thank her for. They had insulted her mother too, and that was something she simply could not tolerate. Shifting the subject slightly, Yuria suggested that her mistress feel free to speak informally with her from that point on. The MC was older than her after all, so it was the least she could offer, and it was rather difficult to refuse Yuria anything when she made that earnest expression. With the matter settled, the redhead offered to fix the protagonist's hair and repair her dress, and Marin accepted without hesitation. She did not have so many clothes that she could afford to discard another one. Taking advantage of the topic, she asked what the significance of a clothing gift was in this region, prompting Yuria to wonder if someone had given her such a gift. Though Marin clarified that not exactly, explaining she had only thought of it because they were already talking about mending garments. The maid considered this for a moment before answering that in the West, such a gesture did carry a very particular meaning. It was said that the person who gives clothing as a gift desires to claim the one who receives it. Lovers, she explained, typically gave such gifts with precisely that intention, as an expression of the wish to possess. Hearing this, Marin was struck speechless and had no idea how to process what the maid had just told her. Surely Gerald did not see her in that way, did he? Shortly after, Olive came to invite Marin and her mother to the visiting room, though he offered no explanation for the summons. A very elegant woman was waiting to receive them, and the curious MC asked who she was, to which the woman responded by introducing herself as Idris Small, a stylist from a dress shop called Blue Era, explaining she had been called to create 2 dresses for the ladies. In the original story, Edra had been the personal stylist of the main character. The women bowed politely to greet the artist as was proper, exchanging formal introductions. Rowena, however, could not begin to imagine why the Duke had thought to summon a stylist to have dresses made especially for her. Though Marin tried to account for it, she asked anyway whether her mother was also entitled to a dress, and the stylist confirmed that the Duke had requested outfits for both of them. That detail caught our girl off guard entirely, because she had assumed the gift was meant only for her. Yet in fact, the Duke had not only thought of Marin, but had also arranged for her mother to receive something as well. She had no idea he possessed such a considerate side. So she explained to her mother that since she had helped Gerald the last time they had encountered each other, he had likely decided to offer dresses as a gesture of gratitude. That settled, Edra produced her measuring tape with visible enthusiasm and set about taking both women's measurements. Marin stood still as the stylist moved around her, and recording every dimension, but something about the girl caught Edra's attention. Although she had introduced herself as a commoner, giving no surname, Marin carried herself with a striking familiarity around the whole measuring process. Furthermore, the instruction to make as many dresses as the girl desired was not an ordinary request by any measure. Studying the MC carefully, a thought began to take shape in the stylist's mind. Perhaps this would eventually lead to an order for a wedding dress. She noted, after all, that it was no coincidence they had asked her to begin with the undergarments. If that were the case, she could not afford to let the opportunity pass. Should she be the one to sew the dress for the future Duchess, the reputation of her atelier, which had been quietly declining, would bloom once more. Edra resolved to demonstrate her finest skill with the most exceptional outfit she could create, for if the orders and clients followed, she would be very well off indeed. Once all the measurements had been taken, Edra suggested that Marin and her mother browse the catalog to select a style that suited them. Since Rowena wanted a winter dress, Edra recommended a high-collar design in thick wool. For Marin, she suggested something in pastel shades, noting they complemented her well, and specifically recommended the second design in baby blue. The catalog featured many new styles that simply could not be found elsewhere in the West, and Marin's mother was thoroughly enchanted by the fact that there was not a single unattractive dress among them. Marin, however, specified that she wanted something easy to move in, which prompted the stylist to suggest she take several models. A little awkwardly, she clarified that one comfortable dress would be more than enough, and asked her to focus her recommendation on something suitable for her mother instead. The stylist was taken aback when she realized that everything was unfolding exactly as His Excellency had predicted, a remark that left our girl thoroughly confused. Edra then explained that the Duke had anticipated the girls would likely choose only one dress each, and had forewarned her that should this happen, he would purchase the entire collection from the studio, offering 12 million gold coins to Edra outright. Determined to prevent the Duke from buying every dress in the shop on her behalf, Marin resolved to go through the catalog once more with greater care. She simply could not believe Gerald was prepared to do something so extravagant. After trying on the dresses, Marin's mind was in complete disarray. Food, money, a roof over her head, she had already received far more than she felt she deserved, and now the Duke was about to add an entire wardrobe on top of all that. There was even a quiet unease in her chest, because all she could offer him in return was reading stories to help him sleep. While she was browsing the library in search of a suitable book to read to him that evening, Zero appeared and asked whether something had happened to her. His sudden presence startled her, but he pressed on, wanting to know why she looked so worn out. He pointed out that she ought to be happy, since word had it she had spent the whole day selecting dresses, information he had obtained from Olive, who was, by the way, an absolute gossip. And yet, for some reason, her expression conveyed nothing resembling the joy one would expect. Marin's lips were pressed together, as though she were weighing whether to tell him the truth. At last, she confessed that she was troubled. She felt she had done nothing but accept the Duke's generosity without giving anything back. Zero had braced himself for something serious, but upon hearing that, he concluded that the Duke likely had more money than even the Emperor, and that Marin was worrying over nothing. Trade with the desert was a monopoly held exclusively by the ducal family, and the man surely sat on a mountain of gold. Marin had not considered it from that angle before. She knew the Duke was quite wealthy, but had not fully appreciated the scale of it. Even so, regardless of how vast his fortune might be, she felt it was wrong to simply accept everything. Marin asked the boy how severe the stomach pain from Mandelson's poison typically was, and he explained that it varied considerably from person to person. She had heard it was also used medicinally. She wanted to know whether there was another plant capable of easing stomach pain. The young man admitted he could not offer much guidance, given that he was quite clearly not a physician, to which the girl responded with an apology, adding that he always seemed to know everything, which was not an entirely unreasonable assumption to make. Flattered by the remark, Zero mentioned that he did in fact have a remedy that could halt stomach pain, though it was not exactly an antidote, and asked whether Marin truly needed it. When she confirmed that she did, the boy agreed to bring it to her, and so he followed along as Marin worked to convince herself that she was making the right decision. Her plan was to help the Duke until the story's true heroine arrived. But to do that, she first had to test just how dangerous Mandelson's poison was, and what better method than trying it on herself. In my opinion, this was an exceptionally foolish idea. The following morning, she made her way to the Duke's garden and found the same dandelion almost immediately. Large flower buds were growing there, and since she needed to extract juice from the blooms, gathering as many as possible was the sensible approach. Our girl lingered in the garden for so long that she did not even notice when the light began to fade. It was time to meet with his lordship. Given how late it had gotten, she would have no time to press the juice from the flowers, so Marin resolved to simply eat the flower directly and observe the effects firsthand. In the office, she stood before the boy once more and asked him to close his eyes and relax so she could begin reading. Before long, however, Gerald noticed a peculiar scent coming from the MC. His sense of smell was, after all, far too acute to miss anything of the sort. It was a remarkable sensitivity. And the MC acknowledged that she had indeed eaten some flowers, asking whether the scent was bothering him. At that, the boy asked if perhaps Olive had been neglecting to feed her properly. But she assured him that he always saw to her well-being and that she ate more than enough, confessing that she had simply eaten the flower out of idle curiosity. Gerald laughed at the reply and remarked that he might need to find better ways to keep her mouth occupied. At that, Marin wanted to vanish on the spot from sheer mortification, doing her best not to let her imagination run away with what that might mean. She resolved to begin the night's reading. Tonight's story was about a widowed mother who lived together with her kind and beautiful daughter. By a fortunate turn of events, the gentle mother had met a handsome young man and fallen deeply in love with him. Marin had barely finished a paragraph when something strange stirred in her stomach. As she attempted to read on, reaching the part where the mother tells her daughter that she will soon have a new father, Her stomach let out a thunderous growl that echoed through the entire office, and our girl was struck by a very real and very immediate pain. The Duke pressed her again on whether that was truly a fairy tale, finding the writing peculiar, but she held firm and insisted nothing was wrong. Marin even attempted to press on, yet her stomach had begun rumbling louder and louder with every passing second. An overwhelming pain cut through her entire body. She crumpled to her knees, struggling to explain that something was terribly wrong with her stomach, though the words refused to come together properly. By that point, Marin no longer had the strength to hold herself together. Without warning, she cut the reading short and bolted for the exit, calling out an apology to the Duke as she fled. The sound of Marin's stomach in open revolt coaxed a faint smile from the Duke, which then gave way to full, unrestrained laughter. That rich, warm laughter spilled out and filled every corner of the office. It struck him as genuinely amusing. Every woman he had ever encountered had gone to great lengths to appear perfectly composed. Yet here was Marin sprinting to the bathroom and very likely too mortified to meet his eyes the following day. Once the laughter had run its course, the boy found himself noticing, almost absently, whether the flowers had always carried such a pleasant fragrance. Alone in her room at last, Marin burned with humiliation at the thought of the Duke laughing at her, convinced she could barely bring herself to face him again. Never in her wildest imaginings had she expected to bolt for the bathroom mid-reading. And all because of that wretched flower? Consumed by shame, our girl blamed herself entirely and cursed the particular misfortune of having tasted that flower on this of all nights. Yuria swept into her mistress's room without warning, immediately asking how she was feeling after watching her sprint to the toilet. When the MC asked how she could possibly have known, Yuria explained that the assistant had passed her a stomach remedy and instructed her to look after Marin. So not only was the Duke now aware that she had fled to the bathroom, Olive knew as well, making this an absolute double disaster for our poor protagonist. Our girl lay back and explained that her body was holding up fine, though the same could certainly not be said for her heart. The maid briefly suspected her mistress might have a fever, but the MC clarified that her temperature was not remotely the issue. At that moment, she was prepared to expire from sheer shame. It was then that Yuria noticed the basket of dandelions and gently asked whether she might make use of some of them. Marin told her sincerely that she was welcome to take all of them, because even looking at them was enough to turn her stomach. The maid plucked one flower carefully and asked Marin to give her just a moment. Determined to bring relief as quickly as possible, Yuria fashioned a compress from the petals and laid it across our girl's forehead, explaining that she had learned this method as a child, that if one made a paste of dandelion with water and applied it, a person's temperature came down quickly. Remarkably, our girl's discomfort began to ease little by little, which came as no surprise to Yuria, who mentioned she had done this many times for her younger brother. Marin grew curious about the brother, and the maid explained that the boy worked as an apprentice knight somewhere on the property. She found herself deeply grateful to Yuria for the care shown and for being so wonderfully helpful. The very next moment, our girl shot upright as though struck by lightning. The realization had arrived. Although dandelion appeared in herb manuals as a cause of stomach pain, it might still be possible to apply it externally to the Duke's skin. After all, giving it to him to consume was out of the question, but applying it topically was an entirely different matter. She had no certainty, but at least ease his suffering. She thanked Yuria warmly, and the maid was genuinely glad to have been useful, even if she had no real idea what her mistress was now so animated about. The whole scene left the maid rather uneasy, studying the MC as though she had suddenly lost her senses. The following day, our girl arrived at the boy's office still flushed with embarrassment over her undignified escape to the bathroom the evening before. The Duke seemed genuinely surprised she had shown up at all, and the girl asked breezily whether anything was the matter, who doing her best impression of someone not dying of shame, and he simply said no. Before the fairy tale reading could begin, however, the girl decided to make one request of him, and when Gerald questioned why he should accommodate her, she replied that what she intended to do was actually for his benefit, which left him all the more intrigued. The heroine asked him to trust her, but to do what she had in mind she would need to touch the Duke, and so she formally requested his permission. At those words, a peculiar expression crossed Gerald's face, and he asked her to repeat herself. This visibly rattled the girl. He had almost certainly assumed the worst, something along the lines of, "How dare a commoner presume to lay hands on me?" Marin rushed to clarify before the misunderstanding could deepen any further. She assured him it was nothing he was imagining, but the Duke was already closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. Gerald drew very close indeed and murmured directly into her ear, asking whether she was warning him that she intended to attack him right then and there. The poor girl went scarlet and stared at him wide-eyed and startled, while the boy met her gaze with patient expectation, his robe hanging open enough to reveal quite a bit of his chest. The silence stretched on, so he helpfully suggested that perhaps she was warning him she was about to go for his neck, which she denied in a panic, prompting him to then ask very simply whether she had not just said she was going to touch him. On the table beside them sat a mortar containing crushed dandelions, and nearby a white cloth laid out on a tray. Still standing with his robe unfastened, the Duke asked Marin precisely where she intended to begin, and it was rather impossible not to notice how well-defined his figure was. The MC did her best not to look at the very area she was trying not to think about, but he was so breathtakingly handsome that forming a coherent sentence became completely impossible. Gerald asked, almost idly, whether she was perhaps an assassin planning to touch him with a blade, which caught the lady entirely off guard. The Duke was quite plainly enjoying himself. Exasperated, Marin explained that she had prepared a mixture of crushed petals and had heard it was remarkably effective for relieving headaches, so she thought it might be of some help to him. Gerald, however, admitted that he scarcely needed it. He felt perfectly fine at that particular moment. Even so, our girl pressed on, saying she was well aware that the boy suffered from a dreadful headache each day on account of his work. She wanted to ease that tension and asked him to give it a chance, promising that if it proved useless, she would not trouble him about it again. At last, the Duke consented, and she was flooded with relief. She had already been bracing herself to be dismissed empty-handed, so now it was her moment to deliver. Marin approached the boy with care, gently sweeping his hair aside. She felt a powerful urge to remove Gerald's blindfold, but knew the Duke would be furious and that he would never permit it. So she simply told him she was about to apply the mixture. He asked why she was placing it over his eyes rather than his forehead, to which she replied that cooling the heat concentrated in the eyes was what truly relieved a headache. Already fraying at the edges, the girl continued applying it while thinking that if she said it was a good remedy, he might simply sit quietly and accept it. Gerald then asked whether the MC was applying all that pressure intentionally. Marin firmly assured him that she had absolutely no intention of harming him. Her only wish was to help relieve the severe headache and the eye fatigue, however unremarkable her method might appear. Even with that compress resting against his face, he remained devastatingly handsome, to the protagonist's eyes, and to mine as well. As the cloth soaked in crushed plant sat over his eyes, Gerald asked when she planned to resume reading, and Marin only then realized she had entirely lost herself in studying his face. She returned to reading in a soft and gentle voice, she quietly hoping that this time the plant would bring the boy at least a measure of relief. Reading aloud, she noticed that the moment she reached the final line of any tale, His Excellency would rouse almost instantly. That was precisely why she kept searching for stories that ran a little longer, so he could remain asleep while she read, rather than waking after only a few minutes. When she finally finished, the MC whispered to herself, wondering if he was sleeping deeply this time, and announced softly that she would remove the compress. She leaned in carefully and lifted the cloth from his face, but at that very moment the Duke stirred awake. His hand shot out and caught her wrist, and he asked, startled, what exactly that had been, or rather, what kind of herb she had placed over his eyes. She did not bother concealing the truth, telling him it was weeds from his own garden, the very same thing she had eaten the day before. Gerald identified it immediately by scent alone, and his sense of smell was simply extraordinary. He truly never missed a thing. The Duke asked with genuine curiosity what the weed was called, and Marin told him the flower was called Mendelssohn. After losing his sight, the boy had taken to wearing a blindfold to shield his eyes from irritation, but whether his eyes were open or closed, even the lightest contact would burn him. Yet that day, for the first time, he had felt none of that terrible burning, even as the damp herbs slowly soaked through the blindfold covering his eyes. The compress had rested against his eyelids for quite some time, and throughout it all, the Duke had felt not even a trace of pain. Alone at last after sending Marin off to bed, he summoned his assistant before dawn had properly broken, needing to share what had transpired. Zero shuffled into the office wearing his pajamas and a thoroughly sulky expression, demanding to know why the Duke had seen fit to drag him out so early when he did not even keep normal sleeping hours. At that moment, the endearing little boy shed his childlike form and assumed his adult one, far more striking and considerably more charming. Olive asked Zero to keep his voice down, but the young man bristled, declaring that the Duke had vision problems, not hearing problems, and that hauling everyone in at this hour was the actual problem. Gerald reprimanded him for speaking so informally, but the alchemist shot back that if the Duke found it distasteful, he was free to dismiss him, and that upon returning home, Zero could even claim a ducal title of his own. While the two fell into their usual petty argument over titles, Olive held her composure quietly until he finally stepped in. He revealed that Mr. Zero had gone without sleep for 3 nights straight, developing a new remedy for the master, and that was the sole reason he dared to speak that way. Zero attempted to silence Olive at once, but he explained plainly that this was precisely why that man was so irritable. Gerald took quiet note of their loyalty, though he showed no outward surprise at just how desperately Zero had been trying to help him. Without a shred of patience remaining, Zero suggested that if there were questions, the Duke should ask them without delay, because he was beyond exhausted and would be returning to his room regardless of the outcome. Gerald brought up the plant Marin had applied to him. Zero to remark that many people had been curious about that particular weed lately, and then he wondered aloud whether it had not been Marin, since it was difficult to imagine anyone else asking about such a thing. Gerald referred to her as the temporary employee, and even the alchemist blinked at that. A small, knowing smile settled over the alchemist's face, and he announced that he liked that girl a great deal. So much, in fact, that he proposed Gerald simply hand her over to him. The Duke responded that the girl was not an object to be given away, though even then he still would not speak her name aloud. Growing impatient, Gerald told Zero that he was losing the thread entirely and failing to grasp the situation, until at last he revealed what had long since ceased to be a secret to anyone in that room. Marin was his, and his alone. Here was a man who had never once yielded to the advances of countless noble women, and yet he was now claiming a girl as his own. Zero could scarcely believe what he had just heard. Olive and the alchemist exchanged a long, wordless glance. That man had never uttered anything remotely like it before. These were words neither of them had ever heard pass his lips. And that could only mean one thing. Things were certain to grow far more interesting now that he had learned this. Zero made it clear he intended to remember that conversation. Sometime later, he summoned Marin for a talk. The boy had something important to share, and she came without a moment's hesitation. She assumed he had called her on account of the plant she had used, perhaps wishing to explore the subject further. The fact that the Duke had said nothing even after her arrival seemed to suggest there would be no issue. In the silence, she found herself wondering whether spending so much time alone in a darkened room had made his skin paler than that of most noble ladies. Marin sincerely hoped his health was not suffering because of it. The man barely slept, after all, and rarely so much as glimpsed sunlight. At last, Gerald spoke, acknowledging that the girl had done a great deal for him over that period. For that reason, he had decided to offer her a reward and wished to know what she would like. It was an unexpected turn of events, one even the heroine herself had not been remotely prepared for. She stared at him in undisguised surprise. The sudden proposal rattled her nerves, and she asked for a moment to think, at which point Gerald began counting aloud, pressuring her to decide more quickly. The faster the count climbed, however, the more her panic intensified. When he reached 3, Marin blurted out that she wanted to go on a walk, repeating it at full volume in her flustered state. Gerald pressed further, asking whether she was truly certain or had simply misspoken. In truth, even Marin herself was not quite sure how to explain it. With dry humor, the Duke remarked that dogs were said to need a daily walk, then offered an apology for having overlooked this. Fumbling for a better explanation, she clarified that a walk was more like physical exercise. She suggested it would benefit the Duke to move about a little, and since it was night, perhaps venturing out briefly might suit him. Gerald raised an eyebrow and asked whether she genuinely believed his body lacked exercise, which she denied at once, hastily adding that his physique was, in fact, remarkable. What Marin had actually meant was that his pale skin and his habit of never leaving the office concerned her. This was precisely why the boy found the temporary so endlessly fascinating. Any other person might have laughed it off and asked for something else entirely, but Marin did not. Without hesitation, therefore, he declared he was prepared to fulfill her wish immediately and rose from the sofa. He turned his head in her direction and quietly invited her to take that walk. The curious thing was that Marin had never actually suggested going together. Yet that was exactly how it unfolded. Moonlight bathed the ducal castle, and before them stretched a field of dandelions swaying softly in the cool night breeze, silvered by the glow above. Marin was utterly enchanted, for it was the first time she had ever witnessed that breathtaking sight. She confessed that she had often come to that spot in search of flowers, yet only now understood how much more magical it was under the night sky. The boy asked whether the cold bothered her at that hour, and the MC replied that it did not. The warmth radiating from Gerald himself was more than enough. Marin seemed quietly pleased that he was leaning on her arm rather than his cane, remarking that a nighttime walk was a genuinely wonderful experience before asking whether the garden lights were troubling him, to which he replied that, thanks to her, they were not, since the plant had made that level of light bearable. Then the mood shifted when our girl murmured that she truly wished his lordship could see what she was seeing. Without warning, he lowered his hand and stepped forward, leaving Marin behind to call after him, alarmed that it was dangerous for the Duke to walk unguided. He looked even more striking beneath the moonlight, his face tilted up toward the sky as he absorbed the atmosphere his eyes could not show him. Then, slowly, Gerald reached up and began to untie the black blindfold, something he had never once done in Marin's presence before. The two stood face to face, and Marin was instantly lost in what she beheld. The Duke's eyes were pale and deep, yet there was nothing unsightly about them. Nothing at all. Gerald possessed eyes white as snow with a silver sheen, like the gaze of a fairy born from the heart of winter. There was no darkness within them, only a blinding, luminous light. He broke the silence by asking whether the girl standing before him was frightened to see him this way. He stepped closer, questioning whether the sight of his true appearance filled her with revulsion. Gerald was quite certain he must appear monstrous. A chill swept through her body and warmth flooded her chest when she heard her employer suggest that those were her thoughts. When she answered no, the protagonist was asked why, in that case, she had stepped backward. Without pretense, Marin confessed it was simply because he was extraordinarily handsome. Gerald had not anticipated a compliment. He had been entirely certain Marin would turn and flee in horror at what she saw. Yet the MC's face had lit up with genuine delight, and she admitted she was taken aback by his beauty now that the blindfold was gone. He drew closer still, raised his hand to her cheek, and whispered that there was only one thing he regretted. He wished he could see her expression, yet that, he said, was beyond him. Ever since the incident with the monster, his eye color had shifted from black to silver, and silver was the color of a monster's eyes in that world. So he had spent years concealing them at every cost, quietly wondering whether he himself had become the very creature he feared. And yet here was the woman who captivated him so. She's standing before him and calling those eyes beautiful. The quiet moment between them was shattered when a voice rang out, calling for the Duke. It was Olive who arrived breathless and left his master wondering what had caused such a commotion and why the attendant appeared so agitated. The boy had a letter in hand and explained that it had just been delivered, an extremely urgent message. The letter bore a red seal marking it as something exceptional. Its contents revealed that the Count's wife had recently passed away. Marin held her breath. She knew precisely who that woman was to Gerald and understood that the two had been deeply close. He remembered her as a child, calling him a brat in the middle of her games without a care in the world. Back then, the young master had disliked being addressed as though he were a small child, and had longed to grow up as fast as possible. Gerald was slight in stature, and his sister frequently teased him for not even reaching her waist, which was why she called him baby, leaving him thoroughly exasperated even when she offered sweets by way of apology. Every time the small boy would furrow his brow and vow never to play with his sister again, no matter the bribery. But she knew his temperament all too well. She knew he would relent, particularly the moment he laid eyes on the size of the treat she had brought. The girl laughed, for she was willing to do absolutely anything for her little brother. She would have plucked real stars from the sky if he asked. Extending her pinky finger, she made him promise he would keep playing with her and would never take offense again. The bond between them was extraordinarily close. The sister adored her brother fiercely throughout their childhood, and the two were inseparable in those early years. Yet the day Gerald would have been able to honor that promise to her never arrived, and the situation took a turn that could only be described as a genuine nightmare. It happened because the blood secret manifested far sooner than anyone had anticipated. Even the faintest sigh reached his ears as though it might shatter his eardrums, and he could make no sense of anything around him. His sister likewise could not understand why their parents refused to intervene when Gerald was suffering so visibly, but unfortunately nothing could be done. The boy collapsed to the floor, weeping bitterly from the unbearable ringing in his ears, while the girl screamed that he was in pain and someone had to do whatever was necessary to help him. He had been only 5 years old when his private torment began, and from that day forward he was confined to a great tower, left to endure it all in complete isolation. Having learned of the blood secret from his father, he threw himself entirely into the practice of mastering the 5 senses that remained to him. As a result, the hours of absolute solitude stretched far longer than any time the young master was permitted with his family. On one of those lonely days, as he sank deeper into his isolation, the boy heard a painfully familiar voice that raised goosebumps along his skin, calling him tenderly a brat. He could not have mistaken it for anything else, for it was that voice that had been his anchor throughout every hardship of his childhood. It was his now-grown sister who had since learned everything about the family secret and about the condition of her younger brother. She also knew perfectly well that the young master could hear her voice even from a distance, so there was no need to conceal her approach. The sister said their father had gone entirely too far this time. He had refused to allow her to bid farewell to her brother before she departed with her new husband. She had so desperately wanted to tell him about her husband, a kind and handsome man with whom she had chosen to spend her life. The sister promised to live well, and told Gerald that the moment he managed to leave that tower, she would be waiting eagerly for him in the south. Just as she had done in childhood, she extended her pinky finger, certain the brat would understand and feel it. And so he did, for warmth touched the young boy's hand in that very moment. What she truly longed for, though, was to see how much he had grown, whether he had finally reached the height of her waist at last. Tears streamed down her face as she lamented being unable to give her own brother a simple embrace. Gerald heard every single word and resolved that his sister should know he could hear her even at that distance. He devised a plan where he cast a stone from the window which shattered upon landing. Wrapped around it was a piece of cloth bearing a note offering his congratulations on her marriage. The girl picked up the stone and upon reading the message burst into even louder tears, thanking her dear brother from the bottom of her heart. Gerald, for his part, stood at the broken window and simply prayed that his sister would go on to live happily and well in her new life with her new husband. That had been the last time they met, the final conversation the two of them ever shared. And today, the boy's black carriage drew up before the grand estate. Knowing he would not find that woman waiting inside, an attendant stepped beside Gerald and presented a special cane adorned with silver engravings. It was no ordinary object. At first, the Duke could not understand why the alchemist had asked him to bring that particular item, given that he had never traveled with such a thing before. The moment he pulled the handle with a single finger, however, he understood at once that the cane concealed a razor-sharp blade within it. He asked Olive to relay to Zero that the alchemist had done excellent work and seemed to have known all along that the Duke would need it today. Just before he boarded the carriage, a voice called out for Gerald. It was Marin sprinting toward him with a suitcase in hand, announcing breathlessly that she wished to come along. She bowed low before him, and he greeted her the same way he always had, calling her his temporary employee. Gerald mentioned that Olive had told him the girl had difficulty riding in carriages, and he genuinely asked whether she would be all right on such a journey. Even though she insisted she would be fine, he privately suspected the rocking and swaying would be far too much for someone in her condition. The boy understood her worry, yet warned her not to push herself too hard, assuring her he was perfectly capable of taking care of himself. What troubled Marin most was that he had barely slept in days, and all she wanted was to read to him in the carriage so he could rest. But Gerald cut her off, leaning on his cane, and gently promised he would return soon and that all would be well. Resigned, Marin held out a small brown box and asked that he at least take this much, explaining that it contained the very same Mendelssohn herb she had always used with him. Without a moment's hesitation, the Duke accepted it, knowing full well the herb would spare him from the headaches that were sure to come on the road. For reasons she could not quite name, Marin felt a deep unease the moment she laid eyes on the carriage. She stopped where she stood, gripped by a sudden fear. Yet she willed herself to calm down, telling herself that no one would be harmed. Gerald stepped inside, and the carriage began to move away from the castle in silence, while Marin watched it go, sending him off with a quiet prayer for his safe return. Sometime later, the sound of a fist striking a desk rang out from one of the noble's offices the moment news arrived that Duke Gerald was on his way. The young man was furious. He had told the Duke not to come, precisely because of his eyes. His charming wife stepped closer and urged him to calm himself, pointing out there was nothing to be done now that the Duke was already en route. Since matters had progressed this far, she said, they would have to arrange a lavish reception and welcome Gerald in the finest manner possible. At the house of Count Adrian, sunlight fell warmly as the Duke arrived. Everything had been prepared to the highest standard. The moment butler Moreau met the boy, he bowed deeply and remarked that the Duke had made an exceedingly long journey to be there. Gerald stood composed and unsmiling, his cane at his side and his assistant close behind. Olive stated that the Duke had given prior notice he would arrive before the funeral, then asked where the Count's children were. From somewhere nearby, the Duke caught the sound of voices discussing his arrival, and one of them was doubting whether a blind man would really come so far, making it plain that not everyone was pleased to see him there. The speaker had apparently assumed there was no possible way the Duke could overhear a conversation taking place at such a distance. At last, the hosts of the household came to receive our boy. It was Baron Killian, Count Adrian's younger brother, accompanied by his fiancée. He admitted that had he been given more notice, he would have arranged a proper formal reception for that day. The Baron introduced his elegant fiancée. The young woman in the black velvet dress, with striking red hair, was Gelmia Rose, freshly engaged to the Baron. Gerald offered no reply to her greeting, and Olive remained silent, quietly observing the couple. The boy wasted no time in asking where his nephews were, but for some reason, the Baron's composure visibly faltered. He spoke in a strained voice meant to convey grief, explaining that the loss had been too great a blow for the children, and that they were still shut away in their rooms, overwhelmed by mourning. Olive was not satisfied with that answer, expressing indignation that the Duke himself had honored the household with his presence, and the children had not even come to greet him. The Baron countered that he had already reprimanded them on that very matter. Gerald had never had any tolerance for lies. He drove the silver tip of the cane hard into the floor, imposing his authority without uttering a single word. Killian and his fiancée had not expected the Duke to be so forceful from the very first moment, and they both recoiled in shock. The young man demanded to know how the Duke dared behave so insolently, asserting pointedly that there was genuine mourning taking place under this roof. Seizing the moment, Gerald turned the Baron's own words against him, asking how anyone could be speaking of receptions and hospitality if the household was truly in the grip of deep grief. He walked past the guards as Killian scrambled to explain himself, ordering that his nephews be brought before him immediately. The butler offered to escort Gerald to the sitting room while Killian trembled with barely contained rage, his lips curling back in something close to a snarl. It was outrageous. The Duke was treating them as though they were beneath him entirely. Gelmia was incensed that someone could dismiss the Baron so completely simply on account of a higher title. She remarked pointedly that had her beloved already held the rank of Count, he would never have been brushed aside like that. The Baron pulled her close and murmured that she would be a countess before long, though he reminded her they would need to be patient in their pursuit of the title. The girl's thoughts, however, had already drifted elsewhere. She could not work out how the Duke had managed to arrive before the funeral had even taken place. The speed of his coming suggested he held the late sister in far higher regard than Gelmia had assumed, and that made the situation considerably more interesting to her. Some time later, the Baron stormed into his office in a fury, cursing Gerald's name. He enraged that the Duke had appeared on an entirely different day than anticipated. He despised the man. That woman from House Bynes had been a constant thorn in his side. She had always found ways to obstruct him, and now her children would do the same. Killian was certain the Duke suspected something, which meant scolding the children into compliance was no longer an option. He would have to seize control of the situation by whatever means necessary. Time was nearly up. All he needed to do was endure one more day, and the title of Count would at last be within his grasp. Baron Killian stepped inside, greeting the children with a pleasant inquiry into whether they had been on their best behavior during his absence. The air in the room was thick with tension, and the girls visibly shrank at the sight of their so-called tutor. Dia, the eldest daughter of Count Adrian, fixed the man with a furious glare. She knew precisely what he was capable of. While the second daughter, Garnet, sat protectively beside Rubiana, the youngest, who shook with barely contained fear. With cold detachment, Killian questioned why no one had come to greet him, insisting that their uncle deserved a proper welcome. Garnet wasted no time calling him exactly what he was, a demon, accusing him of locking them away and hiding little Pedro somewhere they could not reach. Not a shred of mercy crossed that man's face as he rounded on the girl in a fury, demanding to know how she had the audacity to speak to him that way. Daya's voice broke as she offered a desperate, trembling apology on her sister's behalf. When Garnet moved to answer back, Dia cut her off quietly, stepping forward to handle the situation herself rather than let her sister suffer for it. Killian announcing magnanimously that he would let it go this time, but making very clear there would be no such leniency again. The boy then mentioned the arrival of Duke Bynes, and in that moment Dia understood that only the Duke could be the salvation they had been praying for. She could scarcely believe it and asked in a hushed voice whether the Duke had truly come. Killian warned. Before the Duke, they were to pretend that everything was perfectly fine, reminding them that he and the Count had always appeared to be on good terms. Dia knew she had no choice but to comply, though every bit of it made her stomach turn with disgust. Crushing her fist to hold back her rage, she bargained with him, asking that if they cooperated, he would allow them to see Pedro the following day. Killian replied that everything depended on how well the girls performed before Gerald, warning them to guard their tongues and keep quiet so he would not discover the truth. With that settled, he ordered them all to dress in their finest and come downstairs to greet the Duke at dinner. The moment he was gone, Garnet exploded, demanding to know if Dia had lost her mind and asking why she was degrading herself before that monster. Dia replied with quiet resolve that without it, their uncle might deny them any chance of seeing Pedro at all. The green-eyed girl asked her sister in a small voice whether they would truly be allowed to see the boy the next day. Dia walked over with a tired but gentle smile and promised they would. And little Rubiana wished with everything she had that tomorrow would come quickly. She then asked whether the Duke might be able to get them out of that place entirely, which made Garnet bristle, pointing out that the Duke had never once come to see them and was essentially a stranger to her. And yet even the uncle they had been close to had turned on them completely. So what reason would a stranger suddenly choose to help them? The youngest spoke up quietly, admitting that their mother used to say something about that. And Dia finished the familiar saying, that the House Bynes protected its own. Gerald von Bynes was visiting for the very first time, and none of them truly knew what kind of man he was. Our boy, however, knew that saying all too well. 15 days earlier, a cheerful boy with dark gray eyes and a bright, carefree face had run to his sister, bubbling over with excitement because their parents had promised him a birthday gift, and he wanted Dia to help choose it. Their mother was already waiting in the carriage, calling for Pedro to hurry so they could find the most perfect present. He promised his sister he would return soon, and in that moment the whole family was radiant with happiness simply being together. She playfully tapped the tip of his nose and told him to stay out of trouble and be on his very best behavior. That was the last time they were all together. Not long after, the bodies of the parents were discovered. But of the boy, Pedro, there was no sign whatsoever. Finding her brother became Dia's singular purpose, yet she could not do it alone. She went first to her father's vassals for help, but one by one they turned away from her. The girl could not understand why everything had become so strange, why her mother had died in such a terrible accident, and why the only door left to knock on was her uncle's. When Killian laid eyes on her, he asked with false concern why she looked so pale, wondering aloud if she needed a physician. Dia pushed past the pleasantries and told him plainly that the vassals refused to answer her questions, avoided her at every turn, and that no one was searching for her little brother. She needed someone to help her. Everyone was simply pretending the matter did not exist. Meanwhile, Dia kept feeling as though she were pressing into something that did not concern her, and her uncle announced that she should finally understand why the vassals were avoiding her, if it was not already plain enough. He warned her to stay silent until after the funeral if she ever wished to see Pedro again, the boy who had vanished without a trace. Only in that moment did Dia grasp the full horror of it. This terrible man had hidden the boy, most likely to ensure he would never be able to speak of what had really happened. Without a word of warning, Killian delivered a hard slap across her face, making it brutally clear that she was never to behave that way in his presence again. He snarled that she had best mind her tongue, ordering her upstairs to the room with her younger sister immediately, and adding that if she was obedient, perhaps he would bring little Pedro back to her, alive and unharmed. She had no real choice but to submit, because only by doing so might she ever see her brother again. That meant listening to that man, causing no trouble, and staying confined to the room as he commanded. And so the Baron sealed them in with an iron chain and an enormous padlock. Dia forced herself to stay strong, though an aching longing for her mother pressed against her chest and brought tears to her eyes. She remembered being very small and asking her mother about her brother, genuinely wanting to know why he never came to visit. Her mother had explained that House Bynes had far too many enemies, that they were occupied protecting their own, and that even if he wished to visit, it was simply not possible. Time and again she had returned to the same message, urging her daughter to hold on to one thing above all else. The Duke of Bynes protected them, and her little brother would shield all his daughters without a second thought. Now Dia was passing that same story on to her little sister, and both of them clung to the belief that this man could truly help them. Even so, the younger girl voiced her doubt aloud, whether His Grace would genuinely stand up for her now. Gerald, for his part, was burning with the desire to confront Killian on the spot, but he knew the moment had not yet arrived. His hidden operative, Kai, had been trailing the man for some time, and an opportunity to expose him was drawing near. All that remained was patience. Olive stepped in to report that young Killian was managing the next day's funeral arrangements himself. Most of Southern nobles claim they were never contacted. That was not the worst of it, however. One look at Olive's face was enough to know that something truly grim was still to come. It emerged that the bodies of the Count and Countess had been so badly damaged that they were cremated without delay. Gerald could not accept what he was hearing. The information made him clench his jaw until it ached. He now understood that the Baron had desecrated the memory of his own family without the slightest regard for dignity or protocol. Back at Castle Bynes, Marin stood over a map of the region, seething. The Duke had covered an enormous distance in under a week. Yet even at a grueling pace, the journey should have taken at least 10 days. She could not stop herself from wondering what Gerald must be going through at that moment. Noise unsettled him deeply, and she found herself thinking about how he could possibly endure the chaos of it all, and whether the dandelion tincture had already run out. The deeper problem was that he had not slept at all before leaving, and Marin continued to blame herself for not having accompanied him. She had promised to help him get some rest, yet in the end she had not even been able to board the carriage, undone by her own motion sickness, a fact that made her feel utterly useless. Her brooding was interrupted by a white-haired young man who appeared from nowhere and asked why she was wearing such a troubled expression. His sudden presence startled Marin, and she asked outright who he was. The young man introduced himself with an easy smile. Jerome Rodel Sante, older brother to Zero. So this was what he actually looked like. Something about the name, though, snagged her attention immediately. Sante, the same as the ducal family of the north. What business would the heir to the northern duchy have in the west? None of this had ever appeared in the original story, which left Marin even more off balance, and Jerome, noticing her stare, asked if there was something on his face. She laughed a little awkwardly and recovered by saying he looked remarkably like Zero, which was why she had not been able to stop staring. Catching herself, Marin realized she had entirely forgotten to introduce herself, quickly offered her name, and moved to change the subject. Jerome said it was a pleasure to meet her, but circled back to ask if the resemblance to his brother was really that pronounced. She confirmed it without hesitation. He was the very image of young Zero, and that was precisely what Zero would grow into, which Jerome cheerfully declared to be quite fortunate for the boy. Apparently, the man had a thorough understanding of his own appeal. Even Marin had to acknowledge that she had never encountered someone so effortlessly charming and beautiful, who was simultaneously so guileless about it. Her candid praise seemed to catch him slightly off guard, though Marin meant every word of it. Realizing she had still not answered his original question, Jerome returned to it, asking again what it was that had her looking so worried, and the shadows came back to her eyes at once. Marin admitted that her thoughts had been fixed on the Duke the entire time, that they simply refused to leave her no matter how the hours passed. Even Jerome observed that she worried about him far more than she let on, something Marin herself was reluctant to acknowledge. She denied it firmly, and Jerome simply smiled to himself, watching how things between those two were unfolding in quite an interesting direction. The one thing Marin could not conceal was the depth of what she felt for Gerald, and the blush that crept across her cheeks betrayed her far more clearly than any words could. She reasoned with herself that the Duke was the strongest and most steadfast protector the Empire had ever known, and that he would push through whatever awaited him and find happiness on the other side. There was truly no cause for worry. Yet no amount of self-reasoning could push him out of her thoughts, and his absence had made that restlessness all the more impossible to ignore. A while later, Marin wandered to the stables to spend time with the horses, gently running her hand along the nose of a horse as white as fresh snow. She mused aloud to herself about how much longer she would need to hone her skills before she could ride out with the same ease the Countess once had, and the horse pressed his nose softly against her cheek, as though he could sense the weight on her mind. A small, surprised laugh escaped her at the thought that the horse was nudging her on purpose to pull her out of her spiraling thoughts. Just then, Sebas appeared at the entrance of the stables, his familiar gentle smile already in place. Our girl asked what had brought the head butler all the way to the stables. He said simply that he needed somewhere quiet to gather his thoughts. He shared that back in his days as a knight, the stables had always been the place he came to when anxiety crowded his mind, and that old habit had carried him here again today. A shadow of worry hung plainly across the butler's face. Something had clearly happened, but before Marin could ask, he redirected the conversation entirely. He was turning to the horse and asking whether she could see what devoted daily care it received, its coat gleaming and its spirit vigorous despite its age. With a soft smile, Sebas revealed that the horse had once belonged to the young Countess Adria, and it was plain to see just how tenderly it was kept within the Duke's household. The Countess had a deep love for riding and often pleaded with her butler to teach her fencing, yet because of his duties as vice-commander of the knightly order, Sebas could rarely find the time. Hearing these stories, Marin remarked that the Countess must have been a very spirited woman, and the man admitted that the girl had indeed been overflowing with vitality. The man's heart still ached deeply over everything that had come to pass, and the MC chose to leave him alone with his memories of the Countess out of respect for that grief. Before she could slip away, the butler recalled that the girl had seemed troubled by something and told her she was welcome to unburden herself to him. The MC assured him, however, that it was nothing serious. She had simply been thinking that if she knew how to ride a little better to accompany the Duke on his journey. The butler was taken aback to learn that those were the thoughts weighing on her mind. Clearly, the girl was genuinely concerned for her master's well-being. Flustered, she added that perhaps she had been overthinking it. After all, even if she did go, she doubted she would be of much use to him. Upon hearing this, Sebas offered to teach her how to ride, which caught her off guard, and our girl accepted with immense gratitude. She worried about taking up too much of his time, but he replied gently that it would be no trouble at all, for Sebas still carried regret over having failed to dedicate enough time to the Countess when she had asked to learn, and he had no wish to feel that same remorse again. He went further still, suggesting that Marin also consider learning fencing for self-defense, to which she responded with a laugh and asked whether she was not already too old for that. With a warm smile, the butler assured her it was never too late to learn. She would one day prove herself truly useful to the Duke. With that settled, our girl accepted wholeheartedly, eager to learn everything about horses and blades, and she promised to work hard so the butler would never regret his decision, a vow that brought a gentle smile to his face, for he felt that he could finally begin to fill the hollow that the past had carved inside him. Meanwhile, at the Baron's estate, Dia stared at the elaborate banquet with barely concealed revulsion. Such lavish feasting during a period of mourning was a disgrace, but she reasoned that if it meant the younger ones would be fed, it was better to endure it and find whatever good she could in it. At last, the Duke arrived for the meal, and everyone in the dining room rose to acknowledge him as he entered. The girls also stood one by one. The moment Dia laid eyes on Gerald, she found she could not look away. The resemblance to her mother was utterly striking. Gerald moved first toward Killian, facing him with cold composure, cane in hand. The Baron leapt to his feet at once and pulled out a chair for the Duke, then barked at the children to greet their uncle with proper respect. Dia stepped forward and stated that it was an honor to meet the Duke for the first time, gave her name, and introduced herself as the eldest daughter. Next, Garnet introduced herself as the second daughter, and also gave the name of the third daughter, Rubiana, who then piped up to comment on how tall their uncle was. With introductions concluded, the Baron cut in to announce that since the Duke would be dining with them today, he had instructed the chef to spare no effort, and he invited the boy to enjoy the fine dishes before him. Gerald said nothing. It was Olive who spoke instead, explaining that his master had no appetite today, and that everyone else was free to begin the meal. The Baron bristled inwardly at the boy's manner, silently cursing him as a blind fool, but though deeply displeased, he had little choice but to comply. Little Rubiana was the first to exclaim with delight over the dishes spread across the table. while Dia kept a watchful eye to make sure the girl was eating properly. The Duke observed the sisters' interactions with quiet attention, almost as though he were cataloging their every move. When the meal drew to a close, Oliver told the maid to clear the table and prepare the rooms for the younger children. The maid guided the girls and the youngest toward their room, and one of the older daughters cast a pointed look at the Baron, who appeared entirely confused by what was unfolding. Growing anxious, Killian directed an objection at the Duke. His composure began to crack as he turned to Gerald and demanded to know what all of this meant and why he had dismissed the girls. Killian snapped that regardless of how high Gerald's standing was, he had no right to do any of this. His outrage turned to shock, however, when with a single fluid motion, the Duke drew the blade concealed within his cane and opened a clean cut across his face. Gerald told him coldly to hold his tongue, but the Baron was incensed. The Duke had just sliced open his face, and Killian reminded him that the Empire had laws against wounding a noble without cause. Without a trace of concern, Olive produced a white handkerchief and presented it to the Baron, observing that the wound looked rather severe, before calmly suggesting that Killian press the cloth against it to stop the bleeding. The Baron snatched the handkerchief from the Duke's attendant, who smiled pleasantly back at him because there was little else he could do in that moment. Yet the handkerchief had changed hands so swiftly that it was only a moment later that Killian realized it was not merely a handkerchief. By then, it was already too late. Dread swept across Killian's face. In a swift motion, the Duke drew another sharp blade from his cane and announced with certainty that by accepting the handkerchief, the Baron had consented to a duel between them. Just outside the dining room, Dia heard the word duel carried clearly through the walls and tensed, wondering what on earth was happening in there. She resolved to witness it with her own eyes and asked her sister to look after the youngest while she did. Garnet understood but asked her to come back and tell her everything that transpired between the Duke and the Baron. Before she could step inside, however, Olive urged her to turn back, cautioning that what followed might not be a pleasant sight for her. But Dia asked to be allowed to stay regardless. She was only months away from adulthood, and she felt prepared to shoulder greater responsibilities. Moreover, as the eldest daughter of Count Adrian, she had every right to witness with her own eyes exactly what had taken place within those walls. In a fury, the Baron bellowed that the Duke had tricked him, and that the duel was therefore invalid. He noticed the young girl stepping back into the dining room, which meant she had surely seen that he had never agreed to the confrontation. Yet Dia declared without hesitation that she herself had watched the Baron accept the white handkerchief with her own eyes, and had heard the Duke's proclamation of the duel with her own ears. As far as she was concerned, the procedure was entirely lawful, and the Baron had no grounds to refuse it. Killian could hardly believe the girl had sided with Gerald after having met him for the very first time that night. But the moment he moved to shout at her, a thin and precise blade came to rest against his chin, and Gerald reminded him that in a duel, one could never afford to lose focus on one's opponent. Only then did the Baron fully grasp the position he was in. Falling to his knees, the young man declared that he could not imagine what wrong he had done, and begged forgiveness as many times as it would take. He knew well enough that someone of his caliber stood no chance against the Duke, the Empire's shield, and that any duel between them would end only one way. Without the faintest hint of mercy, the Duke asked whether, knowing all of that, he had truly been willing to act so foolishly. At that, the Baron understood he had been found out completely. The Duke accused him of having dared to lay hands on his own family, while Killian scrambled to deflect, insisting there had been a terrible misunderstanding. He even turned to Dia and pleaded with her to help persuade Gerald that this had all been a dreadful mistake, but all the girl did in response was ask where Pedro was. Naturally, the man feigned ignorance, but she was not about to let it go. She still did not know where her little brother had been taken. She seized the Baron by the collar and demanded he produce the boy immediately, making it clear she did not particularly care what happened to Killian himself in the process. The Baron, however, replied in a shaking voice that he had no knowledge of her younger brother's whereabouts, claiming that he too had been searching for little Pedro all this time. The girl refused to believe a single word of it. She reminded him that he himself had told her before that Pedro was with him, that this was the sole reason she had allowed them to be locked away and starved. And now he had the audacity to claim ignorance of the boy's location, which was an outright absurdity. She had endured his cruel treatment of herself and her sisters for far too long, and in that moment, she was ready to end it all right there. The rage was impossible to contain as anguish swelled in her chest, until Olive gently asked the girl to calm herself, though she did not hear him. Without warning, in one swift motion, the Baron yanked a knife from his coat, seized the girl by the throat, and ordered everyone to stay still, threatening that any further aggression would cost the girl her life. Gerald, however, appeared entirely unmoved by the threat, and asked whether the Baron truly had it in him to follow through, which only stoked Killian's fury further, prompting him to demand why Gerald thought he was incapable of killing his own niece. At that, Gerald began walking toward him at a measured pace, and Killian screamed again for no one in that room to take another step, which made Dia squeeze her eyes shut, bracing herself for the worst. A sharp blade grazed Killian's ear, and loose strands of hair drifted silently to the floor. The metal hovered mere centimeters from her face. That, for now, was Gerald's first and only warning. Killian's eyes went wide with terror, for had he shifted even slightly to one side, the Duke could have cleaved his face open entirely. At last, the girl slipped from his grip, and the man crumpled to the floor as though he weighed nothing, while Gerald stood over the scene without a single change in expression. Looking down at the unconscious Baron, the girl asked quietly whether he was dead, though, of course, that was not the case. She could scarcely believe that justice had finally arrived after so much suffering. Olive announced that the Baron would be brought to trial, so that all could witness the consequences of raising a hand against someone of the ducal household. He then promised, with quiet conviction, that from that day forward neither the girl nor her sisters would be harmed again. Those words broke something open in Dia, and she wept with relief, thinking that without Duke Gerald, the Baron might have done something unthinkable, just as he had already done to her family. In the end, her mother had been right. The house binds protected its own, without exception. The following day, Kai went to Gerald and reported that no trace had been found of those behind the scheme. It appeared that the Baron's fiancée had meticulously erased every lead before vanishing, an exceptionally well-executed plan. The Duke had been a variable the woman had never accounted for. Had he not arrived when he did, she likely would have continued exploiting Killian for far longer. Their conversation was interrupted when someone entered the office. It was Olive who had brought Miss Dia along, as she had decided to speak with Gerald directly. The girl bowed and thanked him for a kindness she said she would carry with her always, adding that now all that remained was to find her little brother. Then, without warning, the Duke declared that he was prepared to assume guardianship over the girl as soon as it could be arranged, something she had not expected in the slightest. He explained that someone of considerable power was clearly pulling strings behind all of this, and until that person was identified, she required protection. The girl understood perfectly what that meant and proposed that the Duke remain until little Pedro was at least found. Through the open window, the sharp cry of a massive black crow rang out as the bird landed on a tree branch near the mansion, drawing the Duke's attention. He asked whether there was any tower on the grounds, somewhere high where birds might choose to perch. To this, Dia replied that behind the mansion, nestled within a small grove, stood an old temple bell tower, though she had no idea why the Duke had asked, and Gerald simply said there was no time for explanations. He needed her to take him there without delay. Memories of a letter his sister had once written to him drifted through Gerald's mind. She had wanted to know more about his life as an adult, and whether he still took offense at being called a baby. She wrote of the gentle southern sun, a peaceful corner the dark creatures never touched, and of how dearly she wished to show her husband everything her fencing training had given her. Just a few days before, she had been walking alone when she stumbled upon a place that bore a striking resemblance to the tower her brother had called home throughout his childhood. The moment she stepped inside, recollections of her brother washed over her, and she had filled the space with his favorite things, even though he had long since outgrown the age of playing. She had wished for somewhere she could miss her brother in quiet solitude, and she dreamed that one day she might invite him to that hidden retreat, until someone followed him there and shattered that dream. Her youngest son had trailed along behind her without her even realizing it, and in doing so, had come to cherish that place as much as she did. Overcome with nostalgia, she wrote that she hoped the little one would grow up to be as wonderful a person as Gerald. Beyond that, the child bore an uncanny resemblance to Gerald, and like all young children who adore secrets, he had been utterly enchanted by the notion of a hidden room. She supposed she would have to pass the place on to Pedro someday. Yet at this very moment, little Pedro sat alone in a dark room, quietly complaining of hunger. The boy was upset with himself for not rationing the snack he had smuggled in, and by now the last of the rainwater he had gathered was long gone. The truth was, he did not truly understand why he was there, nor where his beloved mother had disappeared to. On that dreadful night, his mother had told him to count to 500, and if she had not returned by then, he was to race to the secret room and hide there without hesitation. The little boy had not understood why they could not go together, but his mother had promised she only needed to drive out the wicked man. And she had commanded him not to leave under any circumstances, no matter who called for him, even if it were his own sisters. And should she fail to return, he was to wait there until the Duke arrived to save him, for his uncle would find him and would surely keep him safe. Gerald knew with perfect certainty where the child was, his memory landing on the secret room with the locked door. The frustration was palpable, yet through it all he could detect the sound of Pedro's heartbeat growing steadily louder. Dia looked at him, entirely puzzled by what he was doing. She had been instructed to accompany Gerald and had done so without question, but something felt wrong. Something was missing. The Duke asked Olive whether there was any way to open the door without frightening the child any further. In that moment, Dia could scarcely believe what she was hearing. Could it truly be that young Master Pedro had been there all along? She began beating on the door with her fists, tears streaming down her face, pleading with her little brother to say anything at all. If he was truly on the other side of that door, she begged him to speak even a single word. But behind the door there was only absolute silence, for his mother had expressly forbidden the boy from responding to any voice, even that of his sisters. The girl seemed to lose all hope, concluding that her beloved brother was simply not there. After all, had he been inside, he would have heard her voice and would surely have answered, and he had not. She had never once seen Pedro climb that tower, and she asked the Duke how he could be so certain the boy was there. Yet Gerald remained completely sure the child was behind that door. And if the boy had not emerged even upon hearing his own sister's voice, there was a very good reason for it. The Duke could detect the boy's heavy breathing through the door and knew with certainty he was right there on the other side. Trembling from head to toe, Pedro heard someone approach the door. He pressed his hands tightly over his mouth so that his crying would not be heard. At last, the Duke offered his own theory. Pedro was likely terrified that his family was being held hostage and simply could not bring himself to come out. Dia, however, did not follow his reasoning. Her brother was not even 6 years old. How could a child so small possibly think in those terms? Gerald then explained that his mother must have warned him well in advance that something of that nature could happen. The girl asked whether they would simply have to break the door down, while Olive urged her to be patient, reminding her that the boy was already frightened enough. He needed a little more time. That child was almost certainly already worn down to his very limits. For that reason, forcing the door open and risking greater panic was not an option they could take lightly. The difficulty was that no one outside that room knew what the mother had truly said to her son. So Gerald took a moment and considered what he would do in his sister's position. The Duke addressed the boy directly, announcing himself as Duke Gerald von Bynes, and declared that whoever stood outside had come to protect him. Upon hearing that name, the little one's resolve crumbled. The door swung open without a sound. His sister could barely bring herself to believe the sight before her. Pedro had truly been there the entire time. Exhausted, with heavy and tired eyes, he pushed the door open slowly and stepped out to face the people waiting for him. Having spoken his name once, the Duke said it again, Gerald von Bynes, the venerable Duke, so that the little one would know there was nothing left to fear. Little Pedro's eyes brimmed with tears because for the first time across all those long, frightened hours alone, he felt something like relief wash over him. He was going to be saved, and our boy called out to him too, ready at last to bring him home. But the child was so utterly spent that his legs would not hold him, and his sister rushed forward at once to support him, taking him by the shoulder, until Gerald stepped in and gathered the exhausted boy into his arms, pulling him close against his chest and apologizing for having taken so long. Pedro had nothing left, and he buried his face in the soft fabric of the Duke's shirt and wept with everything he had. Dia wept as well, though her tears were tears of joy at finally having her brother back. Gerald felt the child's small body shaking in his arms and thought of his sister, renewing his silent promise to do everything in his power to protect her children and honor her memory. In that moment, within the hush of the abandoned tower, something invisible took root between them, a bond that would endure long beyond that night. Back at the ducal mansion, meanwhile, Marin was anything but idle, having thrown herself wholeheartedly into learning the art of fencing. She gripped the sword with uncertain hands, Yet she held firmly to the belief that under the butler's careful guidance, she would eventually find her footing. That day, Sabas had suggested they begin by practicing with an ordinary stick, so she could develop a true feel for controlling the sword before ever holding the real thing. When Marin asked whether he had made the training sword himself, Sabas clarified that these were standard blades used by young fencers, and he had chosen one specifically because he suspected a full-sized adult sword would feel far too imposing for Marin, someone who was clearly not yet ready for a real weapon. And so Marin's demanding training regimen began. On the very first day, she trained with a beginner knight's sword, only to find it far too heavy for her. After 2 days of practice, rather than feeling energized, she found herself doing nothing but complaining and groaning from the relentless muscle soreness. By the 3rd day, she had conceded and agreed to switch to a lighter wooden sword instead. Marin even lamented aloud that the butler had taken on a student with no talent whatsoever, worse, she said, than a child, but Sebas assured her she would get there. In truth, he told her, he had not seen a student with such genuine drive to practice in a very long time. In the midst of one of their sessions, however, a servant burst in suddenly, shouting urgent news at the butler. It appeared the Duke would be returning very soon, far sooner than anyone had expected. Clutching her wooden sword and catching the Duke's name in the air, Marin felt a sudden, undeniable warmth at the thought that Lord Gerald was already on his way back. The Duke settled into his office as soon as he arrived, listening as he was informed that security had been arranged for the castle, and that his assistant had assembled a reliable company of capable knights, so he need not trouble himself over the safety of the 2 young women and the little boy. Olive then reported that Lady Dia had made one modest request. She wished to be housed in a separate annex, that no one was to enter without her permission. The Duke promptly instructed Olive to see to it, so that everyone in residence would feel at ease. There was, however, one more matter that demanded attention. The young girl's debut in society was drawing near, and Gerald was concerned that without a suitable female companion, it would be extremely difficult for an unmarried young woman to appear in public settings. Gerald was well aware that if he did not wish to see her sidelined from high society entirely, the debut could not be delayed, and a lady-in-waiting would have to be found without further hesitation. Yet Dia avoided any contact with nobility through every means available to her. As a starting point, therefore, he asked Olive to compile a list of candidates for the lady-in-waiting position and report back once everything was in order. Upon stepping out of the Duke's office, Olive became aware of soft, hesitant footsteps trailing behind him. It was Marin, who had been unable to wait to be summoned and had fortunately found the assistant in the hallway. He asked what she was doing there at such an hour, and the girl wanted to know how the journey south had gone. The Duke caught her voice from within and addressed her again by a new name, Miss Marin, yet she felt nothing but happiness at seeing him again. Casting formalities entirely aside, she pushed the doors open with bright energy and greeted His Grace with a broad smile. Olive noted that there was still a good while before nightfall and invited her to come inside. Gerald would never admit it aloud, but he was genuinely pleased by her presence. Curious as ever, he asked whether anything had occurred in his absence, and Marin told him it was nothing like that. She had simply hoped he would rest early, suspecting he had not slept well during his time away, and moved by that sincere concern she had come prepared. She had brought the flower blend mixture as before, and along with it something to deepen his sleep and speed his recovery, offering him a cup of warm wine as she spoke. With a small smile, Gerald remarked that the girl was like a little dog overjoyed at her master's return, and asked whether she had really missed him that much. Naturally, Marin could barely contain herself at that point and confessed the truth. Dropping his usual composure, Gerald confided that the moment he heard her voice, he felt as though he had truly come home. Marin went still and felt something warm and deeply satisfying move through her at those unexpected words, following such a long return. If she were being honest with herself, she was simply very glad he was back and in good health. Without delay, she offered to apply the eye compress she had prepared once before and asked whether the previous one had helped him sleep during the journey, which the Duke confirmed it had. Then with a quiet gesture, he removed the black satin blindfold covering his pale eyes. Marin asked gently whether it was all right for him to go without the blindfold after everything that had happened, and he replied that he believed so, which satisfied her, as she preferred to apply the compress directly to his eyes rather than over the cloth. That small moment made our girl wonder whether the plant remedy was truly working. Given that Gerald could only bring himself to remove that blindfold alone at that night, and the mere possibility of it made her smile. With that, she settled in and began the evening's reading. She had chosen The Prince and the Pauper, and the moment she laid the herbal compress over his eyes, her warm, unhurried voice carried the words into the room like a gentle current. Yet the boy's thoughts were elsewhere entirely. The image of her lying cold in the earth had kept his heart locked in frost. Yet the familiar scent of old books, the soft fragrance of dandelions, and the quiet cadence of Marin's voice seemed to coax back a warmth he had believed lost to him forever. He sat in his study, eyes covered, listening to her unhurried reading, and for the first time in a long while he felt something close to being alive. Marin read slowly of the heir prince who had disguised himself as a commoner and who once confessed his true identity to a knight, only to be met with ridicule. She read of a world where falsehood and truth were tangled together, where what was false became real and what was real became false. That story planted a perfect idea in the Duke's mind. The following morning, Gerald summoned Marin to his study and said something she could never have anticipated. "Marry me." And he spoke her true name deliberately, Lady Marin Schwentz. A girl of noble blood who stood before him now, utterly frozen in shock. He said that, she was sure. And what's going on in the next chapter of this story? Follow me and we will continue it. Thank you so much.